Everyone, today is the Committee of the Whole for July 22, 2020 for the Committee of the Whole meeting. So the first item in the agenda is the call to order and the Pledge of Allegiance. So everyone stand up.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So can we have a roll call, Pat?
Yes. So President Areta Frada,
Here.
Alder Clouder. Here. Alder Gerhardt,
Here.
Alder Krause,
Here.
Alder Maldonado,
Here.
Mayor Richardson,
Here.
Alder Schroeder,
Here.
Alder Strassman,
Here.
Alder Udell.
Here.
All right, you have a quorum.
Okay, so next on the agenda is the approval of the minutes for the June 24 meeting. Do I have a motion?
Second.
Who was it? I'm sorry.
Clouder and Udell.
Okay.
Any question, correction? All those in favor of approving the minutes from the June 24th meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Nays? The motion carries.
I'm going to abstain on that because I didn't have a chance to read them today since the site was down.
Okay, so we have one abstention. Okay. So next we have item 4, public appearances for non-agenda items, and we have one person, Dave Hurst, and he wants to talk about city budget in corona pandemic, assessment in Jamestown, and development cost. Okay.
Thank you. Again, my name is David Herbst, 2619 King James Way. I'm the current chairman of the Board of Public Works. I have several questions for the board. The first is, what is the city cut during the pandemic to make up for the shortfall that we're expecting due to lack of revenue? Has there been anything cut in the city?
So can we answer that? Misty is here, so the director of finance, so maybe she can give us an answer.
My understanding is this isn't supposed to be a back and forth during public comment. But if you'd like to call me, David, I'm more than happy to talk to you. Either give me a call or send me an email. We can go through that for sure.
Is it, I just need to know, is it our goal to keep the city spending at last year's level, which it should be? It's incomprehensible given the number of people out of work, revenue, businesses being out of service, that our spending would go up. I understand we gave the fire department each 90 hours of additional sick leave this year. Is that true? I believe that is true. Just my rough calculation, that itself will cost $500,000. I'm not sure why that would be done. I'm a critical worker, critical infrastructure worker. I've been given nothing. I'm out in the middle of this all the time, as are grocery workers, people all over. I'm not sure why that was done. So then I'm going to move from what I'm gathering. I don't believe we're cutting our spending, which even the circus in Madison recognized their shortfall and was cutting theirs. The second, assessments versus inflation. I recently received a 4% increase in my assessment. Now I'll read through you the log since 2016. My assessment went up. 2017, 3.4%. 2018, 3.8%. 2019, 12.2%, and this year a proposed 4% on my property. Only Tom knows where I live. I've only been to my house. I have a modest home. Would that be correct, Tom? So if I calculate this out, that's 25% over 4 years, or the rule of 72. My house, my value of my taxes in 12 years would double. When I moved to Fitchburg 33 years ago, our taxes were anywhere from 30 to 50% less than Madison. This year we will be higher. If I look at the inflation rate over that same time, the inflation rate has been 2%. So I just cannot, the year it went up 12%, I made no improvements to my home. I have had a number of neighbors have come and complained to me. Their responses have been either, from the city doesn't care, they have no idea what's going on, versus, there's something in the water here. So I just cannot understand raising an assessment in a situation like this. My wife was off work, neighbors have lost jobs. It's just incomprehensible that this would happen, that we think we can raise assessments and talk about, well, we kept our mill rate the same. That is just unacceptable, unacceptable. And the last, regarding development, we had a couple items before us the last time at Board of Public Works, and the one was a sanitary interceptor to feed the Stoner Prairie development, which I'm in favor of. I'm generally pro-development. But there's a cost to the O'Brien property that's a deferred assessment, okay, until it develops. The O'Brien property is going to be a solar farm. We'll never collect that money, so the taxpayers will be paying, not the ones that are living in Stoner Prairie, but all the other taxpayers are going to pay that forever, okay, never collect. I believe we need to look at our assessment policies on these developments. In this case, I'd say that development pays the whole thing, and then if the O'Brien property does develop, then they would be reimbursed by the O'Brien property at that time. A similar water main at Terra Vesa. We ran a water main. We had to we're running another main to get a loop along a number of properties. The property owners asked, we didn't petition for water, but now we're hit with assessment. I believe in this case there is a value of having public water in front of your property, but in this case I believe that Terra Vesa should have paid for it, and then if in the future, if those residents get water, then they would be reimbursed. These are hidden costs that go to the existing taxpayers on developments. I believe we need to look at our assessment and these things to stop hitting existing taxpayers for future development. Similar one, I'll add one more and then I'll be done, with the Terra Vesa. And I'm pro-development, but we ended up having to build another fire station. We could not locate a central fire station. It was where Terra Vesa was, and that development out there was too far for the response. We could not have a single station. So we ended up with a second one, which cost us additional anywhere from $8 to $12 million. So these are hidden costs that existing residents should not have to bear. We need to look at these things more closely to ensure that existing taxpayers aren't paying the burden for this. The developers and the realtors, they all live in much nicer houses than I do. Are there any questions for me?
Any question for Dave?
I've had a number of residents that called me, and I said, I'm not your alder, okay? I said, call your alders. And so that's all. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Okay, so next we move to the next item in the agenda, and it's the city budget process and procedure by Misty Dodge. Misty, are you ready?
Julia, we have one more comment.
Oh, really? Okay. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Katie, for you, yeah.
So I'm Katie Koza, a resident of Fitchburg 2nd District, and I'll be speaking briefly tonight about hazard pay for poll workers and police accountability. First, I wanted to briefly reiterate my support for hazard pay for poll workers. Keeping the current wage of $8 per hour would be disrespectful, especially during a pandemic. Poll workers should be paid at least $15 per hour for working during a pandemic, and ideally, they'd be paid much more than that. Second, I wanted to summarize my email discussions with Chief Brecklin about policing and police accountability in Fitchburg. He's been very thoughtful and responsive to me. It's important to me that the Fitchburg Police Department perform its duties without racial bias or excessive force. I asked him about plans for implicit bias training, and he said that he has a tentative commitment from a local community organization to provide culturally based training for our department beginning in September. I also asked him about plans to update the Fitchburg Police Department Special Community Task Force Progress Report. And I sent around an email with a link to that. It's also available on the Fitchburg City Government website. This report shows the extent to which the Fitchburg Police Department has met certain goals put forth by the NAACP and United Way. However, this scorecard has not been updated since 2016. As of 2016, some goals had been met, but a number of others had not been met. I believe that this scorecard should be updated soon so that the Fitchburg Common Council has current data to use when making budgetary decisions about the police department. Chief Brecklin has committed to updating the scorecard. We have not decided on a firm timeline yet, although I have suggested September 8th as a possible deadline. I suggest that members of the Common Council read the scorecard and work with Chief Brecklin to settle on an appropriate timeline for updating this scorecard. More broadly, I wanted to show my support for racial minorities in Fitchburg and encourage you to do likewise. Fitchburg is sometimes perceived as a predominantly white suburb that doesn't care much about its minority residents. However, we can transcend that stereotype and show that Black lives do matter here in Fitchburg and everywhere else. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other person online? No? Okay, so now we can move to the next item in the agenda. So it's the city budget process and procedure by Misty Dodge.
Hello, everybody. Let me just get set up. I'm not on mute anymore, right?
No.
Too many screens going.
We've got you.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you everybody for having me talk with you again. I know I've been here a lot lately, but I think these are important conversations for us to have as we go into the budget process and then earlier the CIP process. There's just so many nuances to the processes we're going through that I think it's important to at least have a baseline understanding of the terminology and some of the background context and history of how we got to where we are. So I do appreciate that you're taking this time with me again today to go through this. So tonight's presentation, there is a little bit of overlap with what we did a couple months ago, and those things I'll breeze through pretty quickly. But I kept them in here because I thought it would be helpful to have it all in one place still. But there's some additional information we'll talk about tonight, including some additional terminology and some more context on things. We'll breeze through those budget constraints that we spent a decent amount of time on last time. But then we'll also talk about structural deficits, which you may have heard me say before, and why I don't like them and why I think you should hate them also. And then we'll talk about the 2021 budget, just this kind of structural piece of it and some concerns that we have going
Misty,
into
Misty, can you stop a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
We have too many people in the chamber, so we need to determine how many people can be in the big chamber. 20? Pat?
I believe it's 10.
10 people. Only 10 people can be here in this room. If you want to stay here.
Misty, are you sure about that number?
Pat could answer better for me. It should be posted on the door otherwise. I just heard in our meeting today, I thought it was 10. I'm not certain.
There is a poster there on the door.
It is 10. It is 10 for the council chambers. We're at 25% of, generally it's 40 in there, so 25%.
Okay, so
Is there an overflow room? Or, I know there has been in the past.
yeah, there is a one.
There is, we have the old call room open as an overflow room tonight.
Okay, so I think we can continue. There are some people here with sign that they are supporting the Fitchburg police. And they are marching on the chambers. Okay, so Mystic, we can continue.
Excellent. So basically, we were just talking about what I'm going to be talking about today. Last thing was just the process and kind of the next steps in this. And I'd like to reiterate that we aren't really in the swing of the budget yet. We're still at that very beginning part. So we don't have a lot of very specific information about the budget, just more of kind of that framework that we'll be working on. So some terminology just to refresh your memory from last time. So property tax levy or tax levy. And whenever I say that, that is the total amount of property taxes that we need to collect from all of the property owners in order to do the level of service that is included in the budget. And so how we get there is we look at what the costs are in order to do that particular level of service. We subtract out any revenues that we get other than property taxes, so state aids and user fees and building permits, things like that. And whatever the difference is, that is the property tax levy that we then need to collect, and we send out the tax bills to collect that money in order to do the government services. And then the assessed value tax rate is basically how that money, once we know how much we need to collect, how that is allocated across all of the different property owners. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the presentation about how the assessed values relate to the tax levy in order to get to the tax bills. So we got a little bit more thorough information later. But the assessed value tax rate, this is a dollar amount per $1,000 in assessed value. So for example, last year's AV or assessed value tax rate for just the city, not everybody, but just the city, was $7.96. So to get the amount of the tax bill, you would take the city taxes on the average home, which last year was $310,900, was the average residential home in the city. You would divide that by 1,000, multiply it by that tax rate, and that particular home would pay $2,475 in taxes, again, just for the city portion of the tax bill. So this chart here, you guys had seen before. This is from the adopted budget for 2020. You can see the change in that average home taxes. I think it's important to look at this particular measure because it isolates a little bit the changes in assessed value versus tax rate and that relationship there. You really just look at the average home. This gives you a bit of a better picture on what our citizens are, or the property taxpayers are paying. And so in 2010 to 2011, we had the new library, which caused that increase there. And then over those other years, 2014 to 17, you'll see there's a pretty steep incline there as well, because the city really started to invest a lot into our community. So we had 2 new fire stations, a lot of large road projects, including McKee and Lacey and Post and Index. And then we also had some additional public safety personnel that were hired. So there's a bit of a steeper increase those 4 years too, as we were starting to invest more. This is also a page out of our budget. I like this one because it takes a look at that same average home. So you can see on the far right column for the 2020 budget, the average home was the $310,900. And then what this spreadsheet does is it says of the tax bill that they pay, which is the $2,475, how is that allocated amongst all of the different functions that the city does? So administration, public safety, public works, senior center, etc. So this is a nice way to see that breakdown of where all of that money goes. We talked last time too a lot about general obligation, debt, and fund balance and net position. I won't go through that now because we did it before. But one of the big questions we get, especially at budget time, is where does the city's money go? And so this is a page out of the 2019 annual report. So this looked at the actual expenditures by fund. So not the budgeted expenditures, but the actual expenditures. You'll see it fluctuates quite a bit based on that blue bar in particular. And in 2019, there's a big spike. That's because we had a really large prepayment of debt from TID 4. So TID 4 has been very successful, and they were able to have enough cash to prepay their debt, which reduced the interest costs that the TID had to pay. And so that's why there's that unusual blip there. So at CIP time, which I know we haven't quite finished yet, but are working through, we really focus on the purple and the green bars, which is the Capital Projects Fund and the Debt Service Fund. With the operating budget, we focus more on the blue and the red bars. So the bottom blue bar being the general fund, which is the primary operating fund for the city. And then the red bar is the library, which has its own levy. And then the top lighter blue color is all of the other funds. So we have a lot of different funds in the city, and we have to have a budget for all of them under statute. But really the ones that we focus on would be the general fund during this time. Another way to look at how the city spends our money is by function. So the area where we spend the most is public safety. That would be 43% of our total. And I should clarify, this is just for the levy funds. So just the funds that are paid for by property taxes. So public safety is the highest at 43. Debt service is that top green one, that's at 14%. That's the second highest. And then general government, which would include finance, administration, city clerk, assessing, etc. That's the third highest at 11%. Another way to look at how we spend our money is what purpose that money is. And at its heart, the city really is a service provider. You know, we're plowing roads, we're doing police services, we have the fire services. So it takes mostly employees in order to provide that service. So it's not surprising that personnel or wage and benefits for our employees is our biggest category in the general fund at 71%. This is also important as you go into the budget process, because if you're expecting status quo as far as service levels and employee levels, that there's not a lot of wiggle room, I'll say, in that large percentage of our general fund budget. So then that's how we kind of spend our money. But now the question is, how do we get our money? The biggest spot for Wisconsin is property taxes. So you'll see 73% of the money we receive in the general fund to pay for all those services is from property taxes. Here in Wisconsin, we don't have a sales tax. We don't have a local income tax to help pay for that. We are strictly property taxes, or mostly property taxes. In the past, we may have had some concern because property taxes don't have as much flexibility as some of those others. But I'd say with COVID and the public health emergency that we're having now, having the stability of property taxes has really worked in our favor here in Wisconsin. So this is our property tax levy history over the year. So this is how much money in total we are collecting for city purposes. Again, the green and purple bars are what we focus on the most for the CIP, and the blue and the red bars are really our primary focus during the budget process. So why do we do the annual budget? So it goes back to what service do you want to provide to our residents? You know, and I really still think that the budget is one of the most important things that we do, because that's where you are setting your priorities. If you think that something is a high priority and something that we should be providing, a service we should be providing, you will fund it in the budget. And if you think that there's a service that we're providing that's not as important as something else, that might have to be cut or somehow absorb increases in other areas. So that's why we go through the budget process. It's not just dollars, it's more a policy statement of what our priorities are. And so when we go through the budget, we look at, what level of service we want, which is there's a cost to that, and those are our expenditures. And then we also look at how we want to fund that, recognizing that we have relatively little flexibility there, being so primarily heavy on property taxes. So then once the budget is adopted, we will also set our property tax levy, so how much money we need to collect on property tax bills from all of our property owners, and we'll take that and do that allocation. So a thing I'd like to point out, just as a reminder to everybody, is even though property owners pay their full tax bill to the city of Fitchburg, the city of Fitchburg doesn't actually keep all of the money that's paid to us. So as we go through budget, we'll really talk about the city's share of the property tax bill, which, as you can see from this chart, is just over a third of what the property tax bill is. And the bigger piece of it is the school district at about 45%. And then we also collect money for the county and for Madison College. This is another way to look at our property tax levy over time. So you can see that the total amount that we're collecting is increasing, and this is for everybody. So the city alone is just this bottom blue part. but this also has the school districts, et cetera, in it. So you can see the amount of money that we've been collecting through property tax bills has been increasing. The thing I find interesting about this chart, though, is the orange line graph that goes through. This shows how much the city of Fitchburg actually collects, because we only collect through January 31st, and then Dane County collects after that. And so even as the amount of money and the amount of tax bills has gone up, we're still collecting about 70% pretty consistently over the past decade. So I want to spend a little extra time about the relationship between assessed values, the property tax levy, and the property tax bill. So we all know assessment notices came out this weekend, and I'm sure you've heard the same comment as I have, which is misguided, that the city increases property tax assessments simply because we want to collect more money. And that's really just not how it works. And I know it's hard to kind of explain the process that we use for calculating tax bill, but I think it's an important process to try to understand and to communicate so that people know that just because they got a 40% increase on their assessment, as an example, does not mean that they're going to get a 40% increase on their tax bill. The thing that really affects more so their tax bill is what that levy is and what increases are being done through the budget. So first, some terminology. So assessed value. This is the value that is placed on each of the properties by the city assessor, or by the state manufacturing assessment division. They use mass appraisal, which is very data driven, and there's a manual of rules that they have to follow. And I'm not going to get into all of that piece of it. That's what the city assessor takes care of. But I do want to talk about, how that information then translates to what we do on the finance side. There also is an equalized value. Here in Fitchburg, because we revalue or we look at the sales every year, generally these are pretty close to each other. But the difference is the assessed value is placed on a property level by the city assessor, and the equalized value is a number determined by the state, by the Department of Revenue, that's based on a global citywide scale, and then it's just allocated amongst all the property owners. So they're calculated a little bit differently, and it's actually a really good way for us to check and make sure that our assessments are pretty much in line with what the state thinks it should be overall. And so that relationship between the two then is called the assessment ratio. And because we are a maintenance community, we're usually right around 100%. So this is where the logistics of how a property tax bill is calculated comes in. And I'd like to spend a little bit extra time on this. And if you guys have questions, let's definitely dive into it a little bit more. So I'm going to talk about the mechanics, and then I have a couple of examples to try to look at it a little bit differently after this part to hopefully make it a little clearer. So the first step when we're calculating our tax bills is to set the property tax levies. This is what I'm going to use in my analogy of baking a cake, because I love chocolate. So when we go through our budget process, we will look at, what our total spending levels are. We will subtract out those other revenues, and the difference is our property tax levy. So that's our portion of the cake. But then all of the other overlying jurisdictions have to go through that same exercise. So again, it's the school district, the county, and the Madison College that all go through that same piece. And we put those all together into one cake of how much money we need to collect. The next step then is to determine the tax increment. I call this the frosting on the cake. If you recall from the TID update, properties that are within the TIF district pay the same tax rate as every other parcel, but instead of that money that they're paying in going to pay for the schools and the city functions and all of those overlying jurisdictions, that money is instead diverted into the TID fund. And that fund is then used to pay for the infrastructure and such that's needed for the TID. And then the last step of it is to figure out how that gets allocated to everybody, or thinking of it like who gets what piece of that cake. So what we do is I figure out how much in total we need to collect, including the tax increment. And then from the city assessor, I get those assessed values. And that's how I figure out how much each individual bill needs to be. So the role of the assessment value is important and is definitely a factor in the calculations that we do. But just because a property is increased by an amount does not necessarily correlate exactly to what a tax bill is going to be. Really, the key if you're trying to lower taxes would be to look at our spending and look at how much of a cake we are actually collecting from everybody. And when they do the assessments, I will put in a plug for uniformity. That's really the biggest key for assessments, to make sure that houses that are comparable are assessed comparably. If in theory, if everybody was overassessed by 10%, then everybody's piece of that cake would be the same. If everybody was underassessed by 10%, as long as it was consistent, everybody's piece of that cake would still be the same. And what happens is we need to make sure we don't have discrepancies within the different pieces. And I included this link. Milwaukee Journal Sentinel did an investigation a while back. It's just a 2-minute video I would encourage you to watch. It talks about why when somebody sells their house and they think their value should be lowered significantly, why that isn't the approach that should be made. So it's just 2 minutes. It's a great video. So I did try to do some examples to make this a little clearer. So the first step, as I've said, is to make the cake. So this is last year, this was actually the levies that I needed to collect from our taxpayers to pay all of the other overlying jurisdictions. So we had to collect $9 million for Dane County, $17 million for Madison, etc., for a total of $71 million is how much the total bills for those were. And then our assessed value, or the assessed values of all of the properties added together in Fitchburg, was about $3.3 billion. And now I'm excluding TID in these examples. I'm gonna try to get rid of that nuance. So then our tax rate was about $21 per thing. Now in this example, I'm gonna say that there was no change in the property tax levy. So that's the orange column there. So we're gonna say from last year to this coming year, the tax bills that'll be sent out in December, Dane County needed the exact same amount of money, Fitchburg needed the exact same amount of money, etc. So we're trying to isolate that. So it's the levies are exactly the same. But then the assessments went up 14%. Now this number is not final by any means. There's still a lot of the assessment process that has to happen. But this is a ballpark of what the total assessment went up, is 14%. And so what that does then is our tax rate actually goes down. So then I have some examples of houses to try to narrow it a little bit more. So in the first house, I looked at just our average home. So last year, our average home was $310,900. This year, or the assessment notices that just went out, the average home is $330,100, which is a 6% increase. So if we're assuming, again, the same levy, the only thing that's changing is the assessed values, their tax bill will actually go down because the overall value for the city went up to 14%. The 6% that this value went up is less than that, so their tax bill decreases. Property number 2 is a home that was the average home last year at the $310,000, but they only increased 5% to this year. So their new value for this year is $326,000. Again, their tax bill is going to go down. It's going to go down actually even more because their value went up less, even more less than what the average did across the city. Again, keeping in mind this is all the levies staying the same. Property 3 is an increase where it started with the average home last year, but they had a 10% increase for this coming year. So their new assessment is $342,000. They also will see a drop in the city portion of the tax bill, or of the tax bill as a whole, because their increase was less than the overall. And then property number 4 in my example went from $280,000 to $320,000, which is a $40,000 increase, or 14.3%. And it's pretty close to what the overall increase was. So their tax bill is going to go up $15, which is pretty close in my book. So this is kind of how those different scenarios for property owners would play out if the property tax levy stayed the same. The bigger reason why taxes are going to go up is not based on those assessed values. It's based on the levy increasing. So I did another example where I assumed just a 5% increase for each one of the overlying jurisdictions. Used the same 14% for the total assessed value increase, and then the tax rate went down about 8%. Then I did the same scenarios. So property 1 was the average home. Their tax bill went down a little bit. Property 2, which their increase was a little bit less than the average home, their tax bill went down a little bit more. This property 3, their increase was a little bit more than the average home at that 10% increase. Their tax bill went up a little bit, the $88 or the 1.3%. And then property 4, which is the one that went from $280,000 to $320,000, their tax bill with a 5% increase of all the levies will go up 5.3% for $316. So I know these are a lot of numbers that I'm kind of throwing at you, and I will send out the PowerPoint so that you guys have it if you wanted to kind of play with that a little bit more and run your own scenarios in this example. But I did put together a little chart to try to bring it all together. So these are those 4 properties that I used in my examples, and I used those same values in all of the different scenarios. The only thing that changed is in the first column, their levies were kept flat or 0% increase. I did a 5% levy increase and then a 10% levy increase. So you could see kind of the magnitude of how things would change. So if things were flat, nearly everybody in those scenarios would have a property tax drop. If there's a 5% levy change, it's a mixed bag. But if there's a 10% levy change, everybody's going to have an increase in their property tax bill. So really just trying to show that it's that levy amount and the budgets that are set that would cause an increase in the property taxes more so. So I included a couple other references on here. This Department of Revenue Guide for Property Owners is a really great publication the Department of Revenue put out, and it talks about process, it talks about theory. It's a wonderful document, and I would encourage you to read that. And then the video, again, I have listed. So budget constraints. I'm going to breeze through this pretty quickly because I don't know all that much more information than what I did when I was here 2 months ago. So we have the optional expenditure restraint program. If you remember, this is a state aid program that as long as we don't increase our expenditure level in the general fund above a certain amount, that we will be able to get money from the state. So I have been watching CPI because that's a big piece of the calculation for how much will be allowed to increase. And I have that information through June, even though the calculation goes through September. So I don't know all of it yet, but right now I'm thinking it'll be about a 3.5% increase that will be allowed to do. Again, this focuses though on the expenditure side, not the property tax levy, but the expenditure side in the general fund. So we do have a policy so that we qualify it based on 1 year, we receive payment the next year, and then we actually apply it the 3rd year. This is a great way so that if we ever do have to give up that program, because we just cannot make the criteria to qualify, and that we have an extra year to figure out how we want to deal with that. And then this is that same chart from last time where it shows the history of how much money we've gotten from this program. And it will be important to qualify for that again with the 2021 budget because it is about $600,000 that we would not receive from the state if we don't qualify. So 3.5% seems like a fair amount. The thing to remember though is it is based on the expenditures. So I'll be calculating that through the mayor's process and then also through the council process, making sure that we qualify for that program. And there's the levy limits. Now this is not an option. This one is a state statute requirement. It's also that dollar for dollar penalty if we don't meet it. So besides being illegal, they also will get that money back from us if we choose to do that. So we obviously won't. We will be meeting levy limits. So if you remember my teeter-totter from last time, so in general, in my head, net new construction or inflation is about 2 to 3%. And then net new construction, you would want to get about 2 to 3% just to keep status quo. To would be $68 million in new value, and 3% would be $103 million in new value. So while 2% and 3% doesn't seem like a big number, it actually takes quite a bit of value in order to get to that level. And for this year, I'm getting some more information from the state and from the assessor's office in particular. I still think we'll be in that 5 to 6% range for this coming budget. I'll know a preliminary number August 1st, and then they finalize the numbers August 15th. So once I get those real ones, I will share that with you so you know. So what that would mean is that that additional amount above the inflation amount, and we would have a little bit of flexibility there to either initiate new programs, or we could use that to reduce taxes. So I included a couple of slides about the levy limit form that I have to fill out. So you can see this first section is the actual calculation. It's based on net new construction. And this is last year's form. So last year our net new was 3.5%. There are some adjustments that we're allowed to take, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But our total allowable levy for the 2020 budget was this $23.7 million, which was a 4.2% increase. And so I'm sure you're saying, well, we got a 3.5% net new. How come our levy could increase 4.2? And that's because of the adjustments that were allowed. So these are all of the adjustments. I highlighted the ones that we use the most. So this red one is the amount of debt payment that we have to make. So we can increase our property taxes to whatever level is needed in order to make our debt payments. In fact, we are obligated. We are legally obligated to levy to the amount that we need to pay for our general obligation debt. But it's only to the amount of what the payments are. This green one is also an option for us. So if there are services you want to provide or increases you think are important that don't fit within levy limit, then our next choice would be referendum, which would be going to the residents and seeing if that was something that they would support. And then the blue line that I highlighted is for an annexation. So this line will be important when we take over the town of Madison in 2022. This is where we will get that levy limit adjustment for the value that they're bringing in. So this is the debt service line. So this is the actual instructions piece of it. And this is the same chart you saw before that shows how much outstanding general obligation debt we have, and then how that compares to our statutory limit, but then also our city's policy. And I know looking at this, it looks like we have a lot of room in order to borrow more money. And I would caution you on two things. One, just because we can borrow more money doesn't mean it's a good idea. Remember, people are often willing, if you think of when you buy a house, there's a lot of banks that are willing to lend you more money than what you necessarily feel comfortable with as a mortgage payment. And then two, we will have to raise taxes in order to make those payments. So you would have to pay the principal as well as the interest, and then it also costs us money to go to the market and borrow this money. So even though there's some flexibility there, we need to keep some because we don't know what could happen. There might be some unforeseen project and we need to have some capacity. But then also, when you borrow more, you do have to pay it back. There's also a carryover provision based solely on how I fill out the form, which is the recommendation or the recommended way through Ehlers, our financial advisor. We don't actually use the line for carryovers, but last year we did have a bit of money that we could have levied that we did not. $579 was how much we had left in our levy limits, which is really not a lot of money. And so for those of you that weren't here last year, there was a lot of debate and discussion and some revotes on the amendments to make sure that we stayed within levy limits, and we got pretty close. There's also a levy limit adjustment when the TID closes, and we have factored that into the CIP already. We did close TID 7 with the 2018 budget. We got $16,000 that we could increase our budget then. TID 4, I expect we'll be able to get that levy limit adjustment in about the 2023 budget, and it's about $810,000. And then TID 6, which would be the next year, 2024 budget, if things work how I expect, we'll have $380,000 that will be able to increase our property taxes. Now, again, just because we can doesn't mean that we have to or that we should. There are strategies that we can use so that if we choose not to increase by that full amount because we want to keep taxes lower, we wouldn't lose that capacity. I did include the same levy limit references for you in case you wanted to go learn some more. And then this one, the budgeting toolkit, which is out on the League of Wisconsin Municipalities website, is another great resource if you want to learn about basics in budgeting, but they also have a lot of stuff about public engagement and policies and things like that. It's a great resource for people. So then structural deficits. So you will probably hear that buzzword a few different times as I'm talking about a budget. Structural deficits, I think, are not only unwise, I think it's unfair to future councils when you do that. So what is a structural deficit? So really a structural deficit is when you are committing to something for a future year. So while generally you can't bind a future council could change their mind. When you make a decision in 1 year that doesn't have a financial impact until a future year that they can't really back out on that time, that would be a structural deficit. So some examples would be mid-year hiring without room in the levy limit. So for example, let's say we wanted to hire another finance person for $100,000 for round figures. If we say, well, instead of hiring them for all of 2021, what if we hire them on July 1st? So that the cost is only $50,000 for this year, but it is $100,000 the year after. If you set aside room in your levy limit to plan for that, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you have $579 left to make up that $50,000 the year after, you're setting up future councils to make some tough decisions. Some other examples would be using fund balance for ongoing operations. We have a great fund balance policy at the city where we use it for one-time things and only if it's above our policy and with other very strict criteria. So that should not be an issue here. Also delaying the financial impact of something without room in the levy limit. So if you have a contractual arrangement for something saying, well, we're not going to pay you this year, but we're going to pay you next year, and not setting aside that money, that would also be a structural deficit. And then the last example I have is budgeting for a one-time large savings or revenue to pay for something that's ongoing. So for example, gas right now is relatively cheap. So in theory, we could reduce our price per gallon, but then on the understanding that's probably going to pike back up once the public emergency is all done. And we wouldn't want to use that savings on something that we couldn't then take away the year after, or else you'd be creating a problem for future councils. So again, why are they a bad idea? So the commitment forces the hands of future councils. Now you're making decisions that affect the future without that council having the authority to make that decision. We can create some unfunded holes for future years. And while we've got some safety nets in place, that's not something that's sustainable. And it's especially difficult in the last couple of years as we bumped up against levy limits. When I first started, we had literally $1 million still that we had available under levy limits. And if you remember in that chart where we were increasing pretty significantly over those 4 years, we spent all of that. And now we have that $500 left in our levy limits. So as we get closer to that, these structural deficits are even more important to keep in check. And then really it's just that proverbial kicking the can down the road. So 2021 operating budget. So there are not any new funds right now. So there is state statute that we have to have a budget for every fund, which we do, and we don't have any new ones. So that is easier. There are some pieces that are concerning me as we go into the budget process. I learned from our insurance provider last week that the insurance rates are expected to go up 10 to 20%, which is pretty significant. WRS rates have been released. So for general employees and elected officials, it's flat, but for public safety employees, it's going up 8.6%. And that's just on the rate. So if a public safety employee got a 2% increase, and then the rates also went up 8.6, you'd have to add those together to get the actual increase for the retirement portion. Health insurance premiums are always other wild card that we have, and we do use the state plan. So we have been able to get some pretty good savings by, piggybacking on the contract that they do. We'll usually start with a 7% estimate on what we think health insurance is going to do. And with this year, I'm telling you, it could go either way. I'm a little nervous about that one too, with everything that's going on with the public health emergency in particular. We also talked at the May Committee of the Whole about the FACT TV funding situation. So that's something that we should consider, or at least have a conversation about as we go into this next budget. And then Fish Hatchery Road is going to have to be plowed by the city in 2021. So these are some things that we will have to address in the upcoming budget, even though the funding that's available is relatively consistent. And then, of course, there's the big uncertainty, which is COVID-19 and the public health emergency that we're in. So state aid is the money that we get from the state for general transportation aid, for shared revenue, for expenditure restraint, etc. The city has been fortunate where we are reliant on property taxes, which is very stable, but the state is not. So the general transportation aid, which is our largest aid from the state, is based on gas tax. And as I'm sure you can imagine, gas tax is down because people aren't driving as much. So that's going to be a concern. And then the state is reliant on sales tax, which is down, and income tax, which is down. So the state could, in theory, pass on some of their losses onto our budget. So we may see a decrease there. Numbers I've heard people throw around that are just ballpark estimates at this point is between a 5 and 10% decrease in state aid. There's also some glimmer of hope that maybe another stimulus package will be approved, which will allow the state to backfill their lost revenues, and then they wouldn't have to pass on decreases to us, but I don't know how realistic that is.
Misty, can I ask one quick question for you?
Absolutely.
In the previous slide, you talked about FACT TV, and we talked about that at last committee of the whole, so people are familiar with that. I mean, that really, at this point, would you consider that a de facto
Structural deficit?
Structural deficit, yeah.
Absolutely. So we have been digging into a hole there and hoping that the money keeps coming and it's running out. So that is a perfect example of a structural deficit, and something that now this council is going, or this one or the next one is going to have to figure out.
And then just the other thing is there's more things on that previous slide that aren't on there that we're finding out about, that are costs that are coming that we don't know what to do with. I mean, we just got a little bit of information this week, and we'll be sharing this with council sometime soon about Massa Metro's expected expense increases, which is very significant over the next couple of years. So there's a lot more than just what's on that previous slide that are expenses coming. I just, knowing what I know and seeing that slide, don't expect any extra money for any projects. I'm just being honest. With just trying to keep the things we're doing going is going to be difficult.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aaron, for sharing that. And I forgot about Metro. That would have been a good one to put on here. So back on COVID. So COVID's really going to affect our revenues, not as much as other municipalities, but a little bit. So we talked about the state aid. User fees are also down. So our shelter rentals, our senior center programming, our rec programming, building and zoning permits right now are very strong. And there's obviously hope that those will continue to stay strong, but there is some uncertainty there. Court penalty and fines are decreasing. Interest earnings are decreasing. Room tax is decreasing. And then really the big one, I think, for you guys is that property owner ability to pay. So we all know what the economy is doing right now with unemployment and all of that. And the decisions that you make during this budget do directly affect people. Remember that levy, the cake, is what really determines what happens to people's property tax bills. So budget process. So you do the very similar process for this coming year as what we have in the past. So we do a zero-based budgeting system, which really just means that people start from scratch every year. We do look at trends and what things are expected to cost and that type of a thing, but it starts at zero. We will continue to use most of the same forms, so you'll still see the accomplishments and goals, the narratives, the personnel summary, and then you will see new proposals for staff if there are requests. So how the process works is it starts with those requests from the departments. We ask them to generally be status quo for this coming year. If they do have any requests for things that are additional to status quo, on the executive summary, there's a significant changes list at the bottom that should be able to point out all of those to you. So department heads would submit that. They would have discussions then with Pat and I to learn about what their requests were, to help try to figure out priorities and where there's some opportunities to make changes. They then meet with the mayor to talk about the same thing. And then the mayor ultimately identifies the priorities that he wants to include in the budget that comes to you guys. So it's very, very similar to what we do with CIP. The capital project fund, once we do adopt the CIP in a couple meetings from now, that first column, the 2021 stuff, will automatically go into the first draft of the budget that I give to the mayor. And then if he does make changes between the adopted CIP and the budget, we have to specifically list those out in the letter to make it very transparent for you so you know what's changed. For the TIF funds, they are based very much so on estimated activity. You know, what we know at this point, it's those project plans, like what was just approved for TID 13 amendment. It's those project plans that really set the confines of what we're allowed to spend. So it's not quite as structured when it comes to the city's budget piece of it, because we know that we have that project plan that we have to abide by. Debt service fund is the payments that we make on our external debt. So it's the actual payment that we need to make for the stuff that's outstanding currently. For 2020, I haven't borrowed yet. I expect to borrow in the fall, which will be after when the mayor's budget comes out. So the initial budget will just have some ballpark like placeholder amounts for the debt service fund. And then through the amendment process, we will true that up through the omnibus amendment. For the utilities, they have a slightly different accounting method because it's a different fund type and they have to follow PSC reporting, but otherwise they follow the same process as the other departments. Library is a bit of a unique animal. So the last few years, we've had an arrangement with the library that the property tax levy that they receive from the city is based on net new construction or that expenditure restraint threshold, whichever is less. So net new construction, I think, is 5 to 6%. I'll know for sure soon. Expenditure restraint, pretty sure it's going to be in that 3.5% amount. So the library's allocation was the 3.5%. And now the library is unique where we basically give them the money and then the library board has complete discretion over how they want to spend the money. So while they are incorporated into the city and they do follow the same process and the same paperwork, it's the library board that really has that authority over how they spend it. We also have the refuse and recycling fund. So they will have a budget in the mayor's document, but then there will also be a separate resolution that will set the garbage charge. So for those of you that get a property tax bill or have seen one, it's that bottom right corner where the special charges are, and we charge that separately on the tax bill. So there'll be a separate resolution once the budget is more into the process that will set that amount. And then there's a bunch of other special revenue funds. There's grants and donations. There's the park fee fund. Fact TV is a special revenue fund. So those details are provided by the department heads, similar to the other departments. And then there's often very few changes from that because they have their own kind of constraints. The technology fund and the insurance fund, those are both internal service funds. So these are the ones where we accumulate all of the costs for technology, for example, including MPSIS, and then they allocate out that cost to all of the other departments. So similar to how we say how much money we need for the city and we allocate it to the property tax bills, the technology fund does something very similar where they figure out how much money they need to spend and then they allocate it based on a variety of drivers to each one of the different departments. So while it's set up different, they do follow the same process to make sure that everything is accounted for and transparent. The insurance fund, we do that same internal service fund allocation, but we get the information from CIVMIC, who is our insurance provider. And then I get that information and I do an allocation. So next steps So the mayor's budget will be released on September 18th, according to the schedule that was adopted. On the September 29th and September 30th are when we'll have those budget worksheets. My guess is we'll have those again, just like tonight, where it's going to be in chambers and then also available on Zoom for people that want to participate that way. Technically, this is a finance committee meeting, but it's another one of those where I strongly encourage everybody to attend. It's your chance to learn about what the departments are requesting, help get your questions answered, and just make sure that you can make informed decisions when we go through the rest of the process. So then October 13th, we have our first public hearing. October 15th is when amendments will be due. So very similar to what we're doing now for CIP. The form is a little bit different, but it's the same concept. Then I'll submit all of those out on October 23rd so that you guys can all see what those amendments are that are being proposed. Now this is where it gets a little bit different for budget versus CIP. So for budget, because there are often a lot more amendments than what there are at CIP because it's a much broader conversation, we actually have a separate committee of the whole meeting to talk about the amendments. So it's always the October committee of the whole. We will go amendment by amendment and you can discuss it. So you're going to ask your questions. You can say whether or not you think it's a good idea or how you want to see it change. All of the discussion on the amendments really should happen at the committee of the whole meeting. Then on November 10th is when we'll have another public hearing so that we can get public's input on the amendments. And then we'll vote on the amendments and we'll adopt the budget. One of the reasons why it's important that we do all of the discussion at the committee of the whole level is because by the time we get to the council meeting, we're just going to vote. There's strict limits, which I'll talk about in the next slide about certain requirements, but it's supposed to be very mechanical and very organized and very structured. So while we're talking about amendments, so I'm also allowed one omnibus amendment. I like to think of it as the Misty fixing amendment. So things that, we get a new estimate in that I need to incorporate, that final debt, because I'm not going to borrow for 2020 until after the budget's released. I'll fix those amounts for the 2021 budget in that omnibus amendment, and some other things that might come up. So it's kind of that fixing thing. So when we get to the council floor, so this is now the first meeting in November. So we had the discussion on all of the amendments in the October committee of the whole, and now we're at the council meeting in November. So there are limits to try to make this very structured and efficient. So there are debate limits. So you can only talk on each amendment for 5 minutes, and each council member can only speak twice on each amendment. And then that includes amendments to the amendments. So let's say there's an amendment to add another person to the finance department. I'm using that example a lot. So let's say there was an amendment to that, and then somebody could do an amendment to say, well, not a full-time person, we're going to make it a part-time person. Even those amendments to the amendments, you still can only have 5 minutes and 2 times speaking per council person. And we will have the city attorney probably on Zoom keeping track of that. So who's talking, and then Pat usually has the stopwatch to make sure that we meet those limits. So a majority vote can extend the debate for 10 minutes, but we do have to take a separate vote on each one of those extensions. So again, the goal is just to make it as streamlined as possible because all that conversation and debate and discussion happened already in October. This meeting, we're just voting. So once we get through each one of those amendments, there'll be an opportunity for closing statements. So any council member that wishes to make a closing statement may, up to a total of 5 minutes, where they can kind of explain why they voted the way that they did, like that, if you're interested. I'm going to get a total of 5 minutes. And then a big thing to keep in mind is very similar to CIP, that floor amendments aren't allowed. So if you want to possibly change something in the budget, it needs to have an amendment there. And we don't allow changes from the floor. And that's purposeful because, allowing things from the floor will make it more likely that a decision will be made that's not fully informed and it hasn't had a chance to be vetted by the public. Because we have those public hearings and that's what the public thought that we were going to vote on. And so those are the things that we need to make sure we stick to the votes on. So then there is kind of a little next step piece in here. So as I mentioned before, the last few years now, we've been really close to levy limits. If like microscopic close in the whole frame of things. So we've added kind of this extra step. So the first resolution that you'll approve the night of the budget is authorizing these procedures, which is really just basically an amendment do-over opportunity that night. So this is from that document. It's from last year, but I envision the process staying the same for this coming year because I thought that it worked out pretty well. Obviously not ideal. You'd like to think that you could vote on the amendments and they would all stick as they were. But sometimes if you go through all of those and at the end of it we don't meet levy limits, that's not going to be an option. So we needed to have a mechanism to go back and basically reconsider some of those other ones until we could get to a budget that we could legally pass. So the first step will be approving the process, which is a little unusual, or at least outside of what the ordinance is contemplated. Then we'll go through the traditional budget amendment process for city ordinance. We will take a recess while I calculate to see, what our levy limit restraints are, what the tax rate is, estimated tax rate would be, do we qualify for expenditure restraint, that type of thing. Also coordinate with the city clerk to make sure that I got the amendments right. So we take usually a 5 or 10 minute recess while we do all of those calculations. Then step 4, this is that big nuance that's not included in the ordinances. So this would be possible reconsideration of those amendments. So traditionally, if you wanted to reconsider something that council voted on, there are Robert's Rules of Order as far as timelines and who's allowed to make those motions and that type of a thing. And by passing this alternate procedure, we're basically saying we're going to ignore Robert's Rules of Order for this purpose, and we're going to allow anybody to bring up any amendment again for reconsideration in any order, and it can be from anybody. However, each amendment can only be reconsidered once per round, and then it's not required. So if you know for sure that amendment number 1 was something you guys were solid on, we don't have to reconsider that one. But if 7 we want to think about again, and maybe 3 we want to think about again, and then number 15 we want to think about again, and we would have that opportunity to reconsider those. And then we do have some limits again on speaking, just to try to make this as streamlined as we can. So we reduced it so that each council person can only speak once on each amendment, including amendments to the amendment. Again, the theory being that all of that discussion has happened on multiple times when we get to this point. A total discussion on the amendments would be limited to 5 minutes, but it could be extended upon approval of council. And then we would still not entertain any amendments from the floor. Again, because we want to make sure we're transparent with our public and they've all been vetted. So once we go through any reconsiderations that we would want to do, we would take another short recess. I would calculate it again, see if we are within levy limits and expenditure restraint, etc. And then if not, we would go back to step 4 and everybody, you'd be allowed to reconsider the amendments again. If you do meet it and you want to move forward, then we would go to adopting the omnibus amendment, which is that fixer amendment. And then everybody would get their closing statements. We'd adopt the budget resolution and go from there back to the kind of the ordinance process. So when we get to the council adoption, so council will need to adopt the resolution, which adopts the budget, and then they also need to set a property tax levy amount for those tax bills that would be coming out. And it does just take a majority vote of council to approve it. It's not a super majority. And then it has to be done by roll call. So that will happen. There is also contemplated a mayor veto process. I hope we don't have to go there. We haven't since I've been here, which is good, but it is an option under the ordinance. So the mayor has 5 days. He could either veto the entire budget or he could replace certain line items with smaller amounts. So I like to think of this as he can take things out of the budget, but he can't put things back into the budget. And then he can do it as a whole or line by line, certain things. If that is done, then council would have an opportunity to override that veto. So those do take a 2/3 vote of council to override the veto, and it is done separately. So if he, for example, does pick these 5 things that he wants to take out, you would vote to override each one of those 5 things separately, not as a package. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Otherwise, I know the mayor does have some questions for you too. which I have up there now. So as we're working on the 2021 budget, do you have any priorities that you want to make sure that he knows about? Do you have any new initiatives you're considering? Or do you have any services that we're currently providing that you think are not as important and should be considered for cuts? So Julia, I'll turn that back over to you then.
Okay, so thank you, Misty. As always, it's good to have a refresher. Any question for Misty? This is your chance. No? No? Randy?
This presentation, it will be available
Yes.
online. You'll send it out via email, the PowerPoint?
I'll send it out via email. And so for those of you that are in the council chambers, it's in your agenda packets folder, but I will send it out to the whole council so that those of you on Zoom can get it as well.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? No? Wow. Okay, so next we move to the next item in our agenda, and it is the Fitchburg Police Department overview. Without this Chief Brecklin. So Chief, it's all yours.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Council, for the invitation to chat with you this evening. Scott, is it all right if I share my screen at this point?
Go right ahead.
All right, and also for the council members, I did send an email with a PDF of the PowerPoint that I'm going to be working my way through this evening if you want to follow along with that as well. So to start my presentation, I do want to, again, thank you for the opportunity to chat with you tonight. And since some of you may not know much about me, I'm just going to briefly cover some items from my professional career here. I started in policing in 1995, full-time with the Village of Oregon Police Department just to our south. Worked for that department until 1999 when I came here to Fitchburg to begin my service. I've served in a variety of roles here at Fitchburg PD to include police officer, neighborhood officer, patrol sergeant, lieutenant, and now police chief. I was selected by the Police and Fire Commission in January of 2018 to be the third police chief in the police department's nearly 50-year history. So during this presentation, I'm going to try to move through the slides relatively quickly, considering it is already 8:15 and nobody needs to listen to me for an extended period of time. You're probably already ready to call the night, to be honest with you. But I'll talk about, obviously, an overview of the police department, briefly touch on our budget and some statistics that were released, as always, through budget processes and the annual reports that we put out. And then talk about the services we provide, what guides our service, our outreach activities, and talk about our hiring, training, and call response, our use of force, department staffing, and some items on the horizon. So I do also want to remind you, or at least request, with Zoom, it's a little bit cumbersome on the questions. So if you don't mind waiting till the end of the presentation, jot down any questions you may have as I'm going through, and then there'll be an opportunity at the end for discussion of any questions. So an overview of Fitchburg, you see a city map here. We're about 35 square miles, as you know, of urban, suburban, and rural areas. There's over 115 road miles in the city, over 29,000 residents, by last count, well over 700 businesses, and we are served by 3 school districts here in the city of Fitchburg. You will note this map is highlighted with 2 colors. That indicates the districts of police service that we provide. Talk a bit more about the police service by district and the reason behind it in a couple of slides here. But generally speaking, the city is divided into a West District and an East District with 2 sectors for patrol officers within each district. And the border for those districts is Fish Hatchery Road from McKee Road all the way to the southern limits of the city, and then the Capital City Bike Trail moving north of Highway PD or McKee Road. The reason Fish Hatchery Road was not utilized for the entire border is because we wanted to ensure some neighborhood continuity to the best extent possible so that officers were not patrolling, or the borders for the districts were not splitting neighborhoods in half to the best extent possible, and would also improve, ideally, our response times. So what you have here in front of us is actually our first public unveiling of our new mission, vision, and value statements. Our existing mission, vision, and value statements were put together in the early 2000s, right around 2000, 2001. And when I assumed this role, one of the early initiatives that I wanted to try to get done was a refresh or an update to our mission, vision, and values of the department. Unfortunately, as with everything I'm learning, it takes a significant amount of time and resources, and oftentimes we're tasked with dealing with other priorities and not able to work on things like this as quickly and efficiently as we would like. But we began this process to update our mission, vision, and value statements in March of last year. A small work group of department members put together to work on this project. And the objective was to create a concise mission, vision, and values statement that department members could easily recall and use to guide their service that they provide to the community. In our current statements, they contain a lot of words, and we wanted these statements to have much more powerful meaning to them. That work group met periodically as their workload and schedules allowed. They sought input and feedback from other department members as they worked on this process. And again, what you see in front of us now is the new mission, vision, and values statements, again, that we are unveiling this evening. Our mission now is simply to serve and respect, and our vision is to be a trusted, impartial partner in the pursuit of a peaceful community where all members feel safe and respected. We've also updated our values to reflect where we see our guiding principles. Service, we exist to serve the community through education, prevention, protection, investigation, assistance, and partnership. Teamwork, we work with others to do what is right for the community. Accountability, we hold ourselves responsible to those we serve, including each other. We recognize accountability as the cornerstone of trust and legitimacy within our community. And finally, respect. We value human life, the community we serve, and constitutional policing. We treat others the way we desire to be treated, with an emphasis on dignity, empathy, and fairness. So from now moving forward, we will be using these mission, vision, and values statements as our foundational guiding documents for the service that we provide to our community. Speaking of the services we provide to our community, we provide an extensive amount of service to our community. Obviously provide 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week emergency and non-emergency police response. We conduct proactive patrols, traffic enforcement, and crime prevention as time and resources allow. Examples of proactive patrols and services that we provide are our speed display trailer that moves throughout the city to help educate motorists in areas where we are receiving traffic complaints. We also provide a vacation watch service, and we, in the last couple of years, are also conducting notifications of residents if we see their garage doors open, typically during the overnight hours, as a crime prevention measure. We conduct criminal investigations throughout the city, and that also includes conducting criminal investigations for criminal activity that is reported at Oak Hill Correctional Institute and Oregon Correctional Center in Southeast Fitchburg. We engage in public education activities. Examples of those include active threat response training for schools, businesses, and other organizations. And we also conduct periodic robbery response training for businesses, and in particular, the financial institutions here in our city, of which there are about a dozen banks and credit unions in the city. Other services we provide: police records and background checks, alcohol license and city permit reviews, citywide special event planning and coordination. We offer a fingerprint service as well. And we have trained animal control officers and humane officer services available here under the police department umbrella. In addition to parking enforcement on both public and private property, and we are fortunate to have a dispatch center here within the police department that provides dispatching of police calls for our department. They are linked with the Dane County Communications Center. The Communication Center in downtown Madison answers 911 calls for the city of Fitchburg, routes them out to us for dispatching. Our dispatch center takes non-emergency calls here, and they also answer for other city departments when they are unavailable, such as the fire department, utility department, and so forth, and also in overnight hours or weekends. So typically speaking, if you call the city of Fitchburg for some sort of emergency in particular, non-police emergency, you are likely to reach a Fitchburg employee through the police dispatch center answering a non-police emergency line, such as a water utility emergency. We have some specialized teams and units within the department. Those include our special events team, our canine team, a motorcycle team, and an honor guard unit. One additional unit that I'm hoping to bring back was intended to come back this year is our bike patrol unit. Unfortunately, COVID-19 canceled bike training courses, and therefore we were unable to send any officers to be trained on bike patrol. I think bike patrol is a valuable unit to bring back to the city. It's something that I did as a neighborhood officer, what's becoming a long time ago. And it is just what I view as another opportunity for us to utilize our ability to interact with our community members. And a bike oftentimes is a very easy way to engage with the community. Next, I'll cover some statistics. Again, all of this stuff in the statistical section was released in our 2019 annual report. That is available on the city's website in the police department section. I'll highlight a few of the numbers here. 23,521 calls for service last year, approximately 785 arrests and 547 referrals to the district attorney's office, 895 vehicle crashes within the city, 10 Narcan deployments, 108 thefts from motor vehicles, and 1,500 glow sticks handed out during our annual Halloween patrols. Next is a call for service graph over the last 5 years. Officer initiated calls for service are in black. 911 initiated calls for service are in gold. The black dashed line is other citizen-generated calls, typically non-emergency calls to the police department or to the comm center downtown. And then the gold dashed line is just other classified generated calls that don't fit these other categories. UCR statistics. UCR is an abbreviation for Uniform Crime Reports. That is the Federal Bureau of Investigation's system for reporting criminal activity in our community. This reporting allows the FBI and others, including the public, to use the available data to analyze and evaluate for any number of uses. It is one common metric that can be utilized to compare crime rates across cities or jurisdictions. The FBI is transitioning away from UCR. Several departments have already completed this transition. They are going to an incident-based reporting model, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides. And Fitchburg will be transitioning to that model very soon, or that system very soon. Under the current crime reporting system, it's broken down into two parts. Part 1 and Part 2 is the part that is usually of most interest to folks. That is crimes against person and crimes against property. In this chart you see here, we have all of the crimes against persons that were reported to us in 2019. Aggravated assault, murder, rape, and robbery are the highlighted crimes against persons here in this graph. Part 1, property crimes, which include arson, auto theft, burglary, and theft or larceny are here in this chart. You can see where those fall. UCR, or Uniform Crime Reporting, versus IBR, or Incident-Based Crime Reporting. As I mentioned a couple of slides ago, we are going to be transitioning to IBR from UCR. This is a mandated change by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Wisconsin Department of Justice. We have to begin reporting in IBR format beginning January 1st of 2021. It is mandatory. We will begin a certification process next month with the State Department of Justice in order to ensure we are utilizing IBR correctly. So what are the differences between UCR and IBR? I talk about this because I think you're going to see some notable reason for this towards the end of this slide. The UCR reporting uses a hierarchy to report the one highest crime committed during an incident, and UCR captures 27 offenses in its two parts. Incident-based reporting, or IBR, in the case of Wisconsin, it's WIBRS, captures each offense that is a criminal act within an incident. So one major incident or crime may have several lesser crimes. Each is reported. In IBR, where in UCR, only one of those criminal acts is reported, and that is the most significant act. So for example, if we respond to an incident that has charges or criminal acts that include substantial battery, disorderly conduct, and damage to property, in UCR, only the substantial battery would be reported as a criminal act having occurred in our community. Under IBR, all three of those criminal acts would be reported to allow for a more accurate capture of criminal activity and data within communities. IBR captures 52 offenses, which, as you can see, is nearly twice as many as UCR captures right now. This transition is likely going to identify an increase in statistical criminal activity, but that also creates specificity, context, and greater analytical flexibility that can be utilized to identify that crime that is taking place. So as we transition to IBR in 2021 or begin utilizing it, we'll be clear to indicate that we are now reporting activity in IBR versus previously reporting in UCR format and using IBR moving forward. Next chart shows arrests, citations, and referrals over the last 5 years. You can see arrests in black, the black line, and you can see citations issued to adults in the gold line. Juvenile citations are in the dashed black line, and the referrals to the district attorney's office are in the gold dashed line. Our 2020 budget allocation that was approved by council last year was $8.3 million. You saw in Misty's presentation that approximately 71% of the overall city budget is for personnel costs. In the police department, our personnel costs comprise 86% of our operating budget. So you can see by that statistic that we operate on an extremely lean budget as far as any discretionary or flexibility with our spending. Of that personnel number, that includes salary, benefits, and overtime costs. In the other 14% of our budget, which is about 1.1 million, you'll see obligated expenses. Those include costs such as allocations, leases, software and support agreements for software applications that we use, and other contractual obligations that the department has. Examples of items in the obligated expense category would include information technology and MPSIS allocations. We'll talk a little bit more about MPIS here in a couple of slides. Patrol vehicle leases, uniforms, gas, tires, our shared crossing guard with the City of Madison for the Leopold School, and many similar items. The other operating expenses comprise about 2% of our budget, and those include things like money set aside for vehicle repairs and maintenance, equipment purchases and equipment maintenance, office supplies, investigative and evidence expenses, training, critical incident debriefings, and community outreach. And then finally, about $41,000 or 1% of our budget is largely dedicated to mandated training by the state. And we also do annual recertification training on several other things where this dollar amount is used for the equipment, supplies, and other expenses to meet those mandated training requirements and other annual certifications. Our authorized staffing is 52 sworn personnel. That includes the police chief position to police officers. We also have 12 non-sworn or civilian staff and 5 part-time employees as well, or approximately 5 part-time employees, which gives us a total authorized strength or staffing level of 64 full-time equivalent positions and 5 part-time positions. You can see on the left portion of this slide, there are 4 command staff roles or executive level roles in the department: chief, deputy chief, and 2 lieutenants. We have 8 sergeants working 3 shifts. They are responsible for first line supervision of officers, as well as managing our response, our initial response to incidents and calls for service happening in our community. We have 5 detectives, 35 patrol officers. Of those 12 non-sworn or civilian positions, 4 of them are full-time dispatchers, 4 of them are full-time records clerks, 2 of them are full-time civilian service employees who do a variety of tasks for the department, including humane officer certification in response to animal-related calls, parking complaints, and vehicle maintenance, and many other tasks that we are able to free officers up from having to complete. There's also a civilian court liaison role and a civilian administrative services manager role with oversight over the with oversight over the records section. What does that look like when you talk about officers on the street? Minimally, you're going to see 4 officers serving our community with at least 1 and sometimes 2 police sergeants. During peak times, there could be as many as 9 officers on the street. However, peak times would indicate that we are fully staffed with all of our positions, and that none of those positions are currently on leave, currently in the police academy, currently in field training, or currently utilizing vacation, sick leave, or at other specialized training. Suffice it to say is that it's rare that we would have that many officers working at any given time. Typically speaking, our officers work, a portion of our officers work a 6-day on, 3-day off rotation on an 8-hour shift, and about a third of our police officers are in a new schedule that we're evaluating for 2 years, which is a 10.5-hour workday, 4 days on, 4 days off. And all of those shifts overlap with the desired effect of reducing overtime at shift change and improving visibility in our community during those times. Here's our organizational chart. You can see each of the positions here in the chart. We divide up into an operational division and a support division, and you can see where our staffing levels lie within each of those particular divisions. Here's where I want to talk about the MPSIS Group, which is an abbreviation for the Multi-Jurisdictional Public Safety Information System. That's represented in the lower right-hand or lower central right portion of this slide. This was originally a collaboration between the cities of Middleton, Sun Prairie, and Fitchburg to share a computer-aided dispatch system and a records management system and other resources. This collaboration was signed through intergovernmental agreement by all three city councils in September of 2003. So we are rapidly closing in on a 20-year partnership amongst those three suburban communities of Middleton, Fitchburg, and Sun Prairie. The collaboration has since grown to include the cities of Monona and the city of Verona. And through this collaboration, we have hired a shared data analyst. That shared data analyst is now being integrated over the last couple of years into each of the departments and utilized by each of the departments. And all 5 cities are sharing the cost associated with the salary and benefits for this data analyst. And that cost is significantly reduced for each community in relation to each community potentially funding its own data analyst. For instance, I would estimate that a data analyst would probably cost somewhere around $80,000 or $85,000 with salary and benefits if Fitchburg were to have its own data analyst, whereas through this cost sharing agreement and collaboration with these cities, our cost is likely less than $20,000 to have that shared analyst. So this collaboration, again, allows for cost sharing amongst these participating cities and allows us to use technology such as computer-aided dispatch systems, records management systems, and other technology, equipment, personnel, and resources to better inform and guide our use of those resources that we have, and more importantly, reduce the financial cost to utilize these systems and resources to all of the participating communities. Our department staffing. You see a couple of ways in which it's represented here. There's a chart on the left-hand side of the slide, and that information that's in this chart is plotted in the graph on the right-hand portion of the slide. When we look at the years, they begin in 2015, and the population data on the screen is the Wisconsin Department of Administration estimate for the city of Fitchburg. That estimate is provided every fall for the previous January. So for instance, the population in 2019, which was estimated at 29,177, was provided last fall and was the January 2019 estimated population for the city. All indications that I'm hearing are that the estimated population to come out from DOA this fall is going to put the city north of 30,000 in population. And for illustrative purposes only, we are using 30,000 as our population for the purposes of this graph. But what you can see here is that despite the growth of the city, the relative staffing ratio of sworn staff per 1,000 residents has declined from 1.86 in 2015 to 1.73 officers or sworn staff per 1,000. That is despite the fact that we have added 2 police officers. 1 police officer was added in 2017 and 1 police officer was added in 2019. Both of those police officers are added as a result of grant funding that we are receiving from the Wisconsin Department of Justice under their Beat Patrol grant program. And that Beat Patrol grant program, again, is administered by the Wisconsin Department of Justice. They provide grant funding to 10 communities in Wisconsin with populations above 25,000. And the criteria they use to provide that grant money is a review of the UCR data that we previously discussed to indicate the incidence of criminal activity in those 10 communities. So to be blunt with this grant, it's a grant we really don't want because it's based upon our UCR data. And it should be a goal of ours, and it is a goal of ours to ultimately not be a grant recipient for this money. but it is funding those it's partially funding the 2 officers that were hired under this grant. We also added a police detective position in 2019 as well to put us at 5 detectives. So you might be asking yourself or thinking out loud or jotting down for later questions, what would be a recommended staffing level? There is a recommended staffing level that exists. Communities elect to staff their departments based upon a variety of factors. And there are many departments that staff at levels higher or ratios higher than Fitchburg, and there are departments that staff at ratios lower than Fitchburg. We base our staffing requests on many factors, and I'll rattle through some of those factors here now. Those factors include the anticipated continued population growth of Fitchburg. As you can see, Fitchburg has added at least 4,000 residents over the last 6 years. That is likely to continue based upon a lot of the things that are happening in our community from a construction perspective. The absorption of the town of Madison in 2 years is going to add another 1,500 or approximately 1,500 residents to our community. The geography of the city we talked about earlier is 35 square miles. We take that into consideration because that influences our ability to provide visibility, responsiveness to concerns, and reasonable response times. The number, type, and severity of the calls for service we respond to, and how many officers are needed to respond to those calls for service without needing to hold other calls that are coming in and delaying police response to those calls for service. We also factor in our ability to provide proactive services like vacation watch, open garage door notifications, conducting foot patrols, and those sorts of things. We also want to have time available and officers available to build and improve relationships through our community with new assignments like neighborhood officers. And we also recognize the fact that community-oriented and problem-oriented policing are very labor-intensive, and they cannot be effectively utilized if officers are merely reactively responding to calls for service.
Can I just add one quick thing on that slide? Sorry to interrupt. I just was going to add, I was talking a month or so ago to the Verona mayor, Luke Diaz, and this is one of the things that just kind of came up. And if memory serves, Verona strives to be at 1.8. So just kind of a point of reference. I don't know what other cities in the area do, but just wanted to add that point of reference that Verona is at 1.8. And so they just kind of consistently, as they add population, add staff to keep at that 1.8 level.
Thank you, Mayor. So some trends that we're experiencing here in the city. Mental health involved calls for service. CIT is an abbreviation for Crisis Intervention Training. Approximately 30% of our sworn staff have completed crisis intervention training. That is a 40-hour course hosted by the National Alliance on Mental Illness and is designed to improve outcomes on calls involving people experiencing a mental health crisis. Some of the officers that have completed this training will work closely with people in mental health crisis and or their families to involve additional resources, such as through partnerships with Journey Mental Health that will benefit them and help improve their situation and treatment, and also to develop safety and response plans. There is a time commitment involved with the mental health calls that we're responding to. Emergency detentions in particular of people in crisis continue to occur regularly. An emergency detention involves an evaluation at a local emergency room, a consultation with Dane County Mental Health, a transport to Winnebago Mental Health Institute in Oshkosh, and filing of reports and paperwork with the courts. All told, it's not uncommon for 2 officers to spend 8 to 12 hours or more throughout this process. Let me be clear. This is far from an ideal situation for the police, but more importantly, it's far from an ideal situation for the person in crisis and our community members. People in crisis should not be subjected to a lengthy process, including a 2-hour-plus transport in the back of a police car in order to receive emergency mental health treatment. It's clearly a hope of many in law enforcement that many adjustments and improvements are made to the system that we have in place currently to manage mental health crises in our community. The proliferation of digital evidence, investigations are becoming significantly more complex and time-consuming, largely due to digital evidence. That technology includes cell phones, computers, tablets, and video systems. Our investigators are spending a lot of time these days reviewing, analyzing, and summarizing the contents of digital evidence. They need to watch significant numbers of hours of video surveillance, write search warrants and subpoenas to cell phone providers, tech companies such as Google, and social media app companies. As an example, in a recent case investigated by our department, investigators had to examine over 25 individual pieces of digital evidence to determine what, if any, evidentiary value they held. It's clear that those sorts of cases become extremely labor-intensive and time-consuming in short order. Neighborhood and city traffic concerns continue to be reported to the police department. As I mentioned earlier, we attempt to use proactive patrols to improve visibility where we are seeing complaints, where we are seeing crashes, and we also use our portable speed board in a variety of areas of the city based on complaints that we're receiving to educate motorists to slow down. We're also in the process of acquiring 2 pole-mounted speed display boards that can be moved throughout the city. Those will be grant funded through the Wisconsin Bureau of Transportation Safety. So we hope to place, a more permanent temporary solution in areas where we have complaints and can move them around with the assistance of the Highway Department. Property crime continues to trend in a not favorable direction in the city, largely due to theft from autos and vehicle theft. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that in more detail here. And I'm going to begin by showing you a video from a squad car dash camera. This car that you see in front of us was stolen a few hours earlier in the day from a portion from a neighborhood in Fitchburg. We're looking at 11 a.m. in the morning. An officer with our department has observed this car, and this is what you will see afterwards. I'll narrate here as we go along. The officer has stopped the car, and as the officer is getting out of the car, the squad car, this car takes off from the officer. We do not pursue stolen vehicles, so the officer is not going to pursue. However, he observes the car go airborne as it crosses the nearest cross street. Because of the fact that clearly that car is driving at a high rate of speed, the officer's familiarity with the area, he believes that there's likely to be a crash as a result of that car taking off from this traffic stop. You can see the alleyway that this vehicle entered to cause it to go airborne. You'll see as the officer reaches the end of this alleyway that it's evident that this car has struck several of these parked cars and actually continued off the roadway and returned back onto the roadway after this van and then turns left. And you'll see that the vehicle has also struck 2 utility poles. The doors are wide open and they find no one around. It's important to note that this car was operated by 2 juvenile females, and there were 2 toddlers in the back seat of this car when this incident happened. We were fortunate that a resident, they ran into an unknown, an apartment unknown to them as far as who owned it or occupies it after this crash. And we were fortunate the resident pointed this out to us, and we were able to ensure that everyone was uninjured. But the loss of life was potentially significant. The loss of toddler, 2- and 3-year-old kids was potentially significant and could have a lifelong lasting impact on families and our community. And then you look at the property damage that results, several cars being struck, 2 utility poles being struck, this car being totaled, and the car owner not having insurance to compensate them for the damage to this car. This is the seriousness of this situation, and we're fortunate to this point that no one has been killed. We've spent a lot of resources on the last 3 years, 2.5 years on this issue alone. We identified a trend beginning in 2017 where we went from 24 stolen autos in 2016 to 68 stolen autos in 2017. And you can see where the numbers go from there. In addition, theft from auto and home burglary also is related to the vehicle theft problem in our community. The juveniles, which are typically the ones committing these crimes, are not only stealing from cars if they find them unlocked, they are entering unlocked garage doors or open garage doors. They are taking cars from those garages if there are keys left in them, and we are seeing them enter homes if the door from the garage into the home is unlocked to take property and or keys from the residents to then steal the cars. Beginning in 2018, we initiated a department-led collaboration with many stakeholders in our county, and it ultimately grew to stakeholders outside of Dane County because other surrounding counties were beginning to experience similar issues. We met with other law enforcement agencies on a regular basis to share and collaborate on information. We met with community stakeholders to include the district attorney's office, juvenile judges, and youth justice advocates, human services department members to include members of outreach and prevention programs like NIP, Neighborhood Intervention. We also met with community and faith leaders to solicit their help, inform them of what the problem that we were seeing was. And I also presented on at least 2 occasions to the United Way Law Enforcement Leaders of Color collaboration as well. Clearly, there are undesired outcomes as a result from this crime. Crashes, injuries, fatalities, things that I just showed you on that squad video, stolen and damaged property. Oftentimes when vehicles are returned, they're not in the same condition as the car owner had them prior to being stolen. Burglaries are occurring. Weapons are being taken from cars and in these burglaries. There's clearly a potential for confrontations with homeowners or residents, which is extremely concerning. And then obviously an undesired outcome is the arrest history for those committing these crimes at such a young age. The desired outcomes and what we continue to strive through our work in this area is community and stakeholder awareness, collaboration and teamwork across service providers, youth justice, schools, law enforcement, and family, active crime prevention efforts taken by our community members and residents, and obviously an overall reduction in property crime. We'll talk about community. So in our department, we strive to put the community first. We have a long history. I've been with the department for 21 years, and we have, throughout that entire time, emphasized the principles of community policing. We utilize district policing, which you saw the map earlier in the presentation. In our district policing model, we assign officers to either the West or the East District for a 2-year period. This allows our officers to better build relationships with our community and to understand, recognize, and work cooperatively to resolve issues of mutual interest occurring within their district. And that district assignment also increases an officer's accountability to identify problems and issues and to seek collaborative resolution to those issues occurring in their district to minimize the number of times that we are responding to the same issue. And ideally working to resolve that issue entirely so that it's not even occurring. We focus on community partnerships to include neighborhood associations, apartment complexes, school districts, Fitchburg faith leaders, the United Way Leaders of Color collaboration, and joining forces for families. From a neighborhood association perspective, we have a long history of partnering with the Jamestown Neighborhood Association in particular, and interacting with them on a regular basis during their regular meetings. We also participate usually on an annual basis with the Swan Creek Neighborhood Association, the Highlands of Seminole. They typically invite us to provide an annual summary and rundown of things happening in their neighborhood and things that are happening in the police department. We are happy to attend and partner with any neighborhood association. All they have to do is call and ask us, or they can request us through you as their alder. We also liaison with apartment complexes. Examples include Fairways, Pines, Maple Lawn, New Fountains, King James Court. The officers assigned as liaisons to those apartment complexes are expected to meet with the owners or managers of those properties on a regular basis to review calls for service, to identify issues of mutual concern, and identify solutions to any issues that have been identified there. We continue to place an emphasis on foot patrol as time and resources allow, and other neighborhood problem-solving activities, and also, again, with a focus on community outreach. I'll run through some slides that highlight some of the community outreach efforts we've undertaken, usually on an annual basis, but unfortunately, COVID is significantly hampering our ability to do community outreach in a time where I think we can all recognize is very critical in our country and in regards to police-community relations. This is obviously a slide of Coffee with a Cop here, one of our events which we move throughout the city, typically on a quarterly basis, was held at Starbucks. Our community night out, which typically had historically been held in the McKee Farms Park on a Saturday afternoon. Last year, we moved it to Jamestown Hugo Park in recognition of the long partnership we've had with the Jamestown neighborhood, and also moved it to a weeknight. And it seemed to significantly improve our attendance, and we were able to interact with a lot of residents and community members, not just from the Jamestown neighborhood, but elsewhere in our community. Back to School with the Cop was an event that our first event was last year. It was a partnership between our department and Target on McKee Road that allowed a number of Fitchburg kids to go shopping with a police officer for back to school supplies and back to school clothing. We've had a Citizens Academy, I believe, for 9 years now. That is an opportunity for citizens to sign up to learn more about how we police in Fitchburg, an opportunity to get to know our police officers through the instructors and other roles that they have in this academy, and to hopefully build a better understanding of our service and the goals and missions and objectives that we have here in Fitchburg to serve. Unfortunately, with COVID, again, we're not going to be able to do both our community picnic or the Citizens Academy, and we are eagerly hoping we'll be able to get back into the community outreach efforts in 2021. Here's a photo from our annual Halloween patrols where we hand out the glow sticks. We assign an additional number of officers to duty that evening, and we fan out on foot throughout all of our neighborhoods in the community. You can see here are our two most popular members of the department dressed in appropriate uniform for the day, that being K-9 handler John Parker and his partner, who is the most popular member of the police department, Drago. We also partner with Madison Police Department and many other local departments to put on youth police academies for our Latino and Black youth. And we've been a participant the last several years in the Shop with a Cop program, which partners police officers with children and provides an opportunity for them to go shopping for gifts for their family, as well as some items for themselves. We have a long history of always trying to strive to involve our community in conversation to help shape our mission and guide the service that we provide. Some examples are here on this slide. Our body-worn specific listening sessions that were held in 3 different locations and neighborhoods throughout our community when we were implementing body-worn cameras. Conversations with community stakeholders, such as one held last fall at Leopold Elementary School involving the Leopold School Parent-Faculty Organization, and other listening sessions with community in the community to include listening sessions that I've hosted. And last year, we also participated in listening sessions with our community's youth that were facilitated by the Zeidner Center, which is a nonprofit organization based out of Milwaukee that was partnering with us and Madison Police Department. Reports and recommendations. So we use a couple of reports, one on the national level and one on the local level to guide the services and the way in which we police. One of those is President Obama's task force report on 21st century policing. And the other is the Dane County United Way's Special Community Police Task Force recommendations regarding police use of force. Both of those reports were developed following national and local use of force incidents. And in both of those reports, recommendations for best practices for modern law enforcement agencies have been offered. Those include the use of technology, policy and development and accountability, community relations, and officer wellness. One of the items that we have on our website is our scorecard. Ms. Koza referenced it earlier in the public comment section of this meeting. And the United Way Law Enforcement Leaders of Color met again this afternoon. I was a part of that meeting as I am a member of the collaboration. And we are receiving an update on the status of potentially updated recommendations at our meeting in late August. Regardless of the process that the collaboration is using to update and or add recommendations to this document and report, we will begin the process of updating our scorecard and hope to have that completed in the coming months. And at such time, we'll add it, the updated version to our website as well. Body-worn cameras are an identified best practice in both of those reports. Our department is using body-worn cameras, and we began evaluating them in 2015 when we formed a committee of department members to explore policies, develop policies, and explore camera options and identify options for purchase and implementation. This work group that was put together included representatives from patrol, from our police union association, from our supervisory and command staff. And it was rather easy to reach consensus on the need to implement these cameras, on the need to have a sound policy that allows officers to use these cameras in nearly every situation that they are finding themselves in these days. We were awarded a U.S. Department of Justice grant to implement our body-worn camera program. That grant covered just under 1/3 of the total cost to implement this program. And as a result of that grant, it also provided us with access to subject matter experts who evaluated our policy. And these matter experts required a certain benchmark to be met before we could consider our policy to be complete, if you will, in recognizing all of the aspects that a policy for body-worn cameras should encompass. We held community listening sessions, as you saw earlier, in 3 different neighborhoods of our community to seek community input on how we would roll out these cameras and what the policy would look like. They were launched department-wide in 2018. The cameras are obviously used to capture the daily work of officers. They're reviewed by supervisory personnel for compliance and quality control. They're used to investigate citizen complaints. They're used for training and assessments, and they're used to obtain evidence and ensure accurate reporting. I also want to recognize the background you see on this slide. These cameras allow us to show positive interactions that officers are having in our community. And believe it or not, this interaction is an interaction that we were called to investigate some behavior by young juveniles that could be considered criminal in nature based upon the fact if they were older. And what I'm stressing here is that you're seeing the two officers that are interacting with these kids that they're interacting with, or the kids that they're interacting with. They're seated on the grass. They're at these children, the children's level as they interact with them. And I think that this is very indicative of the type of interaction that we strive to have with all of our community members, where we strive to be at their level. There's no doubt costs associated with body-worn cameras, the equipment, the management, storage and processing of the videos. However, we believe that those costs are far outweighed by the benefits provided by these cameras, many of which I've highlighted here. I can say unequivocally that our officers are happy to have body-worn cameras. Restorative justice. Dane County has a community restorative court program with a mission to repair harm, reduce risk, and rebuild community. Please pardon me, but I am going to read a bit about what this community restorative court does to provide a bit more insight. CRC provides young adults who are 17 to 25 years old the opportunity to have their case addressed in a restorative justice circle. In addition to the respondent, victim, and CRC staff, circles utilize community members called peacemakers. These volunteers attend 16 hours of training through the CRC in order to serve our communities as peacemakers. The goal of this process is to ensure accountability, determine alternative sanctions, and to help repair the harm done to victims of crime. Support may be offered to the respondent as needed in areas related to employment, healthy relationships, basic needs, and education. This restorative process is victim-based, offender-focused, and community-driven. I believe we were the third police agency in Dane County to sign on to the Community Restorative Court. We signed our official MOU in April of 2018. Believe that the program began as a pilot in the South District of Madison PD in 2016. The Fitchburg use of the CRC involves a team of officers who review municipal citations that were issued to 17 to 25-year-olds with qualifying offenses of battery, disorderly conduct, resisting or obstructing an officer, criminal damage, and theft. Those cases are reviewed and then sent to the CRC for further review and consideration for using their model to disposition these citations. Our department has referred 82 separate cases to the CRC since April of 2018. In addition to those 82 municipal referrals, the district attorney's office has the ability to refer Fitchburg-related misdemeanor crimes in these qualifying offenses to the CRC as well. We also use data to better inform our policing and how we police. As I mentioned earlier, we are fortunate to have that shared data analyst, and that has allowed us to partner with organizations or stakeholders such as the Dane County Criminal Justice Council. We have provided our enforcement data to the Dane County Criminal Justice Council covering the years of 2016 through 2019. And in July of last year, the council released its first report taking a look at 2016 enforcement data. This is an analysis of police arrest, citations, and summons data contributed by Fitchburg, Madison, Middleton, Monona, Sun Prairie, and Verona police departments. This report is publicly available on Dane County's website. A simple Google search will grab you that report, and it will show you some of the information that we are able to learn and share merely by using the data that we collect and partnering our data analyst with the data analyst serving the Criminal Justice Council. We use social media in our efforts to reach our community. It's in our online community outreach, increases accessibility and transparency. It's a more humanizing format for both police and public to use. We're able to share information, crime prevention tips, and solicit tips from our community. Use of social media and technology is recommendations of both of the reports that I've mentioned. You can see an example of a social media post that's shared not only through our social media sites, but through our email distribution list, encouraging people to prevent property crime. I also want to highlight in this photo that our social media reach extends beyond the borders of Fitchburg. This is a photo that was shared with us from the National Law Enforcement Museum in Washington, D.C. You can see in the lower left is a enlarged portion of the overall photo highlighting the social media post that we had shared on our social media sites. And that was highlighted in one of the displays, or at least included in one of the displays at this museum in Washington, D.C. And we're fortunate to have Lieutenant Hartwick coordinating our social media program, putting together graphics and information like this. Additionally, we've implemented officer wellness initiatives within the department. We have a joint public safety team that has been recently formed with our fire department and our EMS, Veterana EMS, that serves our community. These items were all implemented as a result or through recommendations of both the 21st Century Task Force report and the use of force reports. This public safety wellness team offers peer support and debriefings. We also have an employee assistance program here in the city, and the public safety wellness team has created a wellness website that's listed here on the right-hand portion of the slide, firstrespondwell.org, that has resources and information on it for department members, public safety members, actually really all city employees or anyone else that accesses that site. In addition, the city is recently implementing a chaplain program, and the police department has initiated a wellness assignment program that involves a mental health check-in. I'll talk a little bit about the why behind these things as well, in addition to them simply being recommendations. But police suicide occurs at a rate of more than 1.5 times that of line of duty deaths in our country. More than 225 police officers died by suicide last year, and it's believed that that number is actually underreported. 2 local officers have died by suicide in the last couple of years as well. As a result, we have implemented beginning last year an annual mental health check-in with a contracted mental health professional. All police department members are required to attend this check-in with the mental health professional on an annual basis. We also have included regular debriefings after critical incidents that happen in our community. Also, as part of our wellness program, we require our sworn personnel to annually update their emergency contact and line of duty death packets in the event they are seriously injured or killed in the line of duty. Of course, we hope never to use either of those packets, but we have officers take the time to complete those packets so that they know and their families know that there will be less questions to be answered and less decisions to be made in the event they are seriously injured or killed in the line of duty. That advanced preparation can go a long way in a very difficult situation. All of these steps, again, are designed to address critical incident and cumulative stress that department members experience during their service to our community and to improve their overall well-being. We believe police officers who are well mentally, physically, and in other ways provide better police services to our community. I'd like to talk about our hiring practices. When we identify a hiring process as necessary, we coordinate with human resources on that process, what the steps of the process will be. And then we take a joint recommendation and request to the Police and Fire Commission. We outline the need for the hiring process, the steps that we intend to take, and then we seek approval from the Police and Fire Commission to proceed with that hiring process as outlined or ultimately approved by the Police and Fire Commission. We announce our hiring processes in many more places than we ever used to. And this began approximately 2 years ago under our new HR manager, Sarah Olson, who has done a phenomenal job in her role as an HR manager, and has been very beneficial in assisting not only the police department, but also the city as a whole. You can see all the additional places we now advertise hiring processes. I'm not going to read all of them, or any of them actually, nor am I going to read about the job fairs that we attend on a regular basis. But clearly, we use our recruitment efforts to increase both the number of overall applicants as well as the number of applicants of color. We've taken a number of steps to modify our hiring process in the last several years. We've created an applicant information packet that increases transparency of qualifications, the timeline of the process, salary and benefits, and also provides helpful hints for answering essay questions and the other competitive answers or essays of the application process. We've eliminated the written examination that we used to use for the exam, and we focus our screening efforts not on written exams, but on the application packets that are submitted by each of the applicants. That includes a resume, a letter of interest, essay questions. All of these items are assessed by a panel consisting of department members and human resources members. Applicant names are removed during this screening process, so we have no ability to identify anyone by name. We focus our screening on life experience, prior law enforcement experience, experience with other cultures, and also educational experience. Next steps in the interview process involve a panel interview comprised of a department supervisor, a supervisor from an outside police agency, and a community member. The community member is something new that I added after becoming chief to our hiring and promotional processes. I feel it's important to get community involvement in our hiring processes. After all, these police officers and police leaders are going to be serving community, and community should have a role in selecting and identifying those applicants that are most suitable. Applicants are provided 15 minutes prior to their scheduled interview an opportunity to review the questions and prepare for the interview. And recent updates to the interview questions have a focus on diversity and life experience. In the past, when we used a written test, we'd use an arbitrary test number to identify approximately maybe 20 to 25 people to come in for that panel interview. Since we've removed the test, we now, as I mentioned, use that applicant screening process, and we're interviewing in excess of 40 individuals each hiring process as a matter of routine now. That allows us to get deeper into that applicant pool, and we're not basing who we interview strictly on how they perform on a standardized test. After that panel interview, we take a look at where the candidates are ranked and how many open positions we have to determine the number of applicants moving on to a final interview. That interview is conducted with me and our deputy police chief. We also have several pre-employment conditions for those that are selected after the applicant screening process and both interviews to continue on with approval of the Police and Fire Commission, of course. We have them complete a medical assessment, a drug screen, a background investigation, which is a thorough in-person investigation into their background to determine their suitability to be a police officer, and that will include out-of-state travel if the person is from out of state. We do a psychological assessment on all candidates, and we also have them do an 8-hour ride-along to get to know them better, and ask that they complete a writing sample summarizing their observations and experience during that ride-along. And for those applicants that are selected that need to attend the Law Enforcement Academy, they also have to complete a physical readiness test required by the state. Here are the statistics that we received from Human Resources since 2012. You can see in 2012, we did 3 recruitments. Apparently no recruitments in 13 and 14. Were noted by Human Resources in 2015. You can 16, 17, 18, and 19. You can see the number of recruitments that were each year. The dashed trend line is important. That's the total applicants that we are receiving for our vacancies. And you can see that that line is trending in a downward direction, means that our pools of applicants have gotten significantly smaller than they used to be. There are probably a variety of factors to that, none of which based upon the hour that I'm going to go into at this point in time. But you can also see in the PDF file that I sent you at your leisure other information related to this particular slide. Training. You can see in this particular slide here, for background, this is a joint training that we've done with our fire and EMS departments in active threat response. You can see Fire Chief Pulvermacher on the right-hand side of this slide, providing some instruction to 2 police officers and 2 fire or EMS personnel who are forming a joint team to enter a training situation in an active shoot or active threat situation. Training for our officers begins at the Law Enforcement Academy. There's 720 total training hours through that academy. That curriculum is created by the Wisconsin Law Enforcement Standards Board, and those academies are held at the technical colleges located throughout the state of Wisconsin. We send our officers typically to either the Madison College Academy or the Blackhawk Technical College Academy. The Academy obviously spends time on a number of skills. You can see those there in the slide as well. Our field training process begins after someone has completed the academy, or if we've hired an officer who has already completed the academy and has previous law enforcement experience. Field training process would begin once they start with our department. It is a 14-week program where the new officer is paired with an experienced officer who has been through specified training to become certified as a training officer or field training officer. It's broken into 5 phases with an increased workload for the new officer in each of the 5 phases. The 5th phase is when that officer is assigned a solo patrol, and that phase covers a 12-month period of time during which that new officer receives a monthly interaction with a field training officer and a supervisor to answer any questions, provide guidance, and also to review that new officer's performance. The field training program is designed to build upon skills from the academy or the officer's experience at another agency and tailors those skills to our department and our community's expectations. And clearly the program provides an opportunity to assess suitability. We also have a mandated in-service training. The state mandates an annual of 24 hours. We're required to do vehicle pursuit training and handgun and rifle qualification. Our department partners with the Middleton Police Department on 4 in-service trainings each year for a total of 32 hours to slightly exceed the state mandated requirement. And we work with Middleton Police Department to share our certified instructors as well as other expenses related to the costs associated with in-service training. We focus our training on skill-based training with an emphasis on communication skills and de-escalation tactics, and that emphasis has been placed for many years now. And we also use our in-service training, use classroom-based education to build knowledge and perspective. Some in-service topic trainings that we've had in recent years and sessions include the following. I'm not going to read all of those. As I mentioned, you have them in the email that I had sent to you. We also provide specialized and development training to our department members. This training is focused on employee professional development to improve operations, increase employee retention, and enhance the service we provide to our community. We break those down into job-related training, specialized assignment training, and leadership training. And again, in the next slides, you can see these are really brief selections here of the training that's provided, and certainly by no means all-inclusive, but I just want to highlight a few of them. And when you look to leadership training, we offer training to our staff in leadership in police organizations, which is a 3-week course designed by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. We train all supervisors. Our first line supervisors are provided with training as soon as possible after they assume a leadership or supervisory role. And then those at the executive level, we strive to have them attend a more lengthy development course, either through the Wisconsin Law Enforcement Command College, Northwestern School of Police Staff and Command, or the FBI National Academy. I also want to take this opportunity to talk about use of force in our response philosophy. I think in light of the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis, that it was important to take this opportunity to talk about this information. I know that we in the police profession have been concerned about police use of force and using it appropriately for quite some time. And I know that you and many of our community members have also renewed focus on call response and use of force. So as our call response philosophy, it's paramount to keeping everyone, our philosophy is to keep everyone involved as safe as possible through communication and de-escalation techniques. Prior to responding to or arriving to a call, an officer will do all that they can to attempt to gain as much information as possible with an eye on coming to the best possible outcome. That includes the location or locations where the incident is happening, how many people are involved, are there weapons involved, is it actively occurring, or is this a report of something that's happened in the past? Where are there other officers or backup officers coming from, and when do we anticipate that they will arrive to assist? What is our desirability to act or become involved in this situation at that immediate moment, and is our involvement justified and necessary? Whenever possible, officers are clearly prioritizing trying to slow incidents down, taking time on their calls in order to improve decision-making and effectively communicate with involved parties, witnesses, and other officers. I can't stress it enough, communication skills are at the center of our success. We certainly place an emphasis on communication to improve understanding and safety. I want to talk about our use of force policy. Our use of force policy is based upon standard Wisconsin training curriculum and legal principles. It incorporates and emphasizes department philosophy and priorities. It's modified periodically based upon best practices, department evaluation and assessments. An example of a recent modification a few years ago is in regards to taser use. Previous to the United Way use of force recommendations, we required another officer to be present with lethal cover in order for the other officer to use a taser. We have removed that requirement, which now allows officers to use a taser whenever they feel that that option is a better tool to resolve a situation, in lieu of having to wait for a second officer or have to use lethal cover in the form of a firearm while they wait for that second officer. Our use of force policy reflects a combination of tools, and the policy allows for options to increase the safety of subjects and officers. And it has a continuum in it that allows officers to move up and down based upon the behavior that's being presented to them. Our current policy is under review for further updates and enhancements. One of the items we're using to assess our current policy is the National Consensus Policy on Use of Force. That policy was developed by the Police Executive Research Forum and in collaboration with more than a dozen other organizations to develop that policy. We've also implementing a duty to intervene general order to serve as an addendum to our existing use of policy while we fully incorporated duty to intervene language into our updated policy. You've probably also seen the 8 Can't Wait and perhaps been contacted by community members in regards to the 8 Can't Wait. That campaign identifies 8 policy components, which are listed here on the left-hand side from their website. And the use of those 8 components or incorporation of those 8 components into training and policy, it's believed will reduce police use of force by 72%. I'm pleased to report that our department already had 6 of the 8 components solidly in our policies prior to the latest round of revisions that are forthcoming. And the other 2 are either contained in policy or we have trained philosophically on them, such as a duty to intervene for years. And we simply need to now formally incorporate those languages or strengthen those languages within the forthcoming update. We released a summary as it relates to 8 Can't Wait, as well as our full use of force policy, and put it on our website on June 9th. I believe I also emailed that to everyone, but it can be found on our website. We also have a use of tactics form that relates to our use of force reporting, which, as you probably saw on the previous slide, is a component of the 8 Can't Wait campaign. The snapshot you see on the right is our existing use of tactics form. This form is used by officers to provide initial incident notification, tracking of the use of tactics, as well as supervisory and tactics instructor review. Anytime an officer uses a tactic that's listed on this sheet, to include simply displaying a taser towards someone or displaying a firearm towards someone, they are required to fill out this form to identify the tactics that they used and whether or not there were any injuries that resulted. These forms are then turned into the shift supervisor, routed to the patrol lieutenant, and routed to the deputy police chief in copy format. There are 3 copies to this form. You'd open the 21st century, we could get electronic, and it's on our list of things to do, but I digress here. We have had a use of tactics reporting form in our department since 2006. So for nearly 15 years, we have required officers to report all uses of tactics using a form like this. And this form has been modified several times over the years to better improve the process and capture the type of tactics that are used. You can see on this form on the bottom, each and every form is reviewed by a tactics instructor to determine that the use of tactics was within policy and that the policy training and equipment was adequate. It also, in the lower right-hand portion, has a section where a supervisor is responsible to also review whether or not the tactics were within policy and that the policy training and equipment utilized were adequate. Here are use of force statistics. For the first time in department history, we released this summary in our annual report, or with our annual report. It is contained within that report that was released in February. You can see that of 785 arrests and referrals to the district attorney's office, there were 19 use of force incidents involving a decentralization or taking someone to the ground or higher level use of force throughout 2019. That reflects approximately 2.4% of that 785. And we responded to over 25 total calls for service, and that reflects less than 1/10 of 1% of the total calls for service in which force was used by our department. Assessments. When our department uses force, an assessment, in addition to that use of tactics form where a general review is conducted, certain qualifying uses of force or uses of tactics will garner an assessment. They also require an officer to complete a written report detailing the circumstances and the justification for that use of force. We've required officers to specifically justify why the force they used was necessary for approximately 4 or 5 years now in their written reports. As I mentioned, each officer also completes a use of tactics form that we talked about earlier. And then according to our policy, specific use of force incidents have an additional assessment conducted on them. Those incidents include taser deployments, any incidents in which an officer or citizen was injured during the use of force or tactic, pursuits, department vehicle crashes, any allegations of excessive use of force, and at the mere request of a supervisor or command staff member. These assessments are designed to improve decision-making skills of all department staff by analyzing each incident for the following: adherence to current policy and policy relevance, training application, equipment usage, and appropriateness, as well as other response considerations. Assessments are conducted by uninvolved supervisory staff with the assistance of state-certified instructors who are also uninvolved in an effort to ensure impartiality. Once the assessment is complete, a key takeaways document is authored outlining the training points to reinforce desired decision-making or to correct department expectations. This is a recent update to our policy to develop these key takeaways with an eye on continuous improvement. Coming near the end, I know I've been quite lengthy here and probably droning on here at 9:35. So looking forward, we have several things already in motion here in the department, policy evaluation and updates, most notably the use of force policy that I've already talked about. We also know that in this time, it's more critical than ever to have a policy manual that is up to date and reflects best practices in our profession. And therefore, you are going to see a proposal forthcoming from me next month seeking your approval to begin a process of using an outside vendor to update our policy manual to reflect best practices with an ultimate eye, as we'll talk about very briefly later, towards accrediting this police department. We're also working on improving our data collection and the reports that are generated or that we can generate with this data that's being collected. And we've also recently begun a spotlight series to highlight our responses and other situations occurring in the department. In the interest of time, I won't detail our first item in the spotlight series, but I encourage you to go to the city's website and or our social media pages to see some information about a recent mental health response that our officers were involved in. What's on the horizon? A lot of things, to be honest with you, but these are just a few of the major things that we believe are on the horizon. Department staffing, as we've already talked about, is a need for conversation. I intend to implement neighborhood officers in the near future, staffing willing. We have the town of Madison and additional needs for department staff as a result of growth in Fitchburg. We also have a need for supervisory and command staff. Those are the backbone and the infrastructure of our department and necessary to carry out all of those things that I've talked about, in particular about our accountability measures, policies, assessments, and those sorts of things. And we have a significant need for that role. We have space needs in the police department and city hall that are only being exacerbated by COVID-19 and physical distancing suggestions. As I mentioned, I would like to see our department become accredited. And I think that it would be possible to begin that process after our policy manual is updated, if approved, and begin that process in as early as 2022. And then we're also looking at a way to create a public data portal that would allow public easier access to all of that data that we are looking at putting into reports. How can you stay connected? Use our community crime map site. There is a link on our website, which allows you to view crawl for service activity throughout the city or in a particular neighborhood. You can also sign up to receive alerts about certain activity happening, say within a certain radius of an address, like your home. You can follow us on social media. You can also subscribe to receive news flashes, media releases, and emails sent through our Citizen Watch email distribution site, or email distribution list on the city's website. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to take a department tour. Sign up for a ride-along when COVID-19 restrictions and spread are in much better position, and sign up for a Citizens Academy and participate in that. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, our academy will not happen in 2020, but ideally it will be back in 2021. So in closing, prior to some question and answers, if you are interested, I do want to close by stating that your Fitchburg Police Department is a forward-leaning, service-oriented organization with a mission to provide fair, impartial, and professional police service to our community. We are constantly seeking to identify improvements in the way we carry out our duties, and we are fortunate to have a great team of professional, dedicated, and service-minded people with a genuine care for our community. With that, and in the interest of time, I do have two questions that I would like you to at least ponder, and if you feel like sharing responses to them, feel free to contact me via email or by phone. And those two questions for the council are, what are we doing well and where can we improve? And with that, I will turn things over to the council for any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Chief. I have a couple of folks that they have questions. So first one, Joe.
Chief, thanks you for your very thorough presentation. I know we've had a lot of one-on-one conversations at length. I have a few questions, but I'll stick to maybe one or two. So the first one is about mental health. And I know there have been, a lot of conversations locally as well as nationally about sort of what the police's role in addressing mental health needs are. I did read the post that the department put up, the spotlight piece, and one thing that's sort of stuck with me is that although officers aren't the sort of primary mental health providers that would be ideal, that there is at least some training to identify mental health needs. This is sort of a broader philosophical question, and it's longer term. In your opinion, what would it look like if Fitchburg or other communities in Madison, the Dane County area were to adopt like a cahoots model in which sort of mental health is fully transitioned away from law enforcement into fully trained mental health providers? Logistically, what would that type of a transition look like in your eyes?
Well, you are correct, Alder Maldonado, in that mental health is one of many social issues that the police have been tasked with handling over the last probably 1 to 2 decades. And where we've seen is police, because of our availability of being here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, have become the de facto response mechanism for nearly every societal concern, mental health being one of them. We have taken a number of steps over the years to better improve our response to mental health, again, to identify the best possible outcome. We're doing okay at that, but you are also know I highlighted in the presentation that there's room for improvement, clearly. And I'm loosely familiar with the cahoots model. I've obviously been doing a little bit of research on it, as well as the STAR model that Denver PD is using as well, to see how those could potentially have application in Fitchburg or in Dane County more particularly. And I think there is promise in both of those. I mean, in the Cahoots model, I've seen some conflicting data on how many calls for service a year they actually handle, but I think using the example of 6,000 is one of the numbers I've seen. They're handling 85% of those 6,000 calls for service, first line calls for service with the Cahoots mental health professionals, first aid medic professionals, and only 15% of those 6,000 calls are involving law enforcement. It is clear that in the vast majority of mental health crisis situations, there probably is not a public safety concern, and therefore maybe you do not need a police response to those. There always will be a certain subset of mental health related calls that are going to generate a public safety concern. But let me give you an example of how we treat our response to mental health in addition to the spotlight call you highlighted. We were recently asked to do a check welfare on a subject who was threatening to die by suicide by hanging themselves. And we responded to that call, as we always would, with 2 or more officers, trying to gather as much information as possible before we even made contact or arrived on scene, talking with the caller to determine why we were needed and those sorts of things. Our officers arrived. They attempted phone contact and were unsuccessful to a certain extent, and were ultimately able to engage in a dialogue with this person who was threatening to die by suicide. The person wouldn't let us into the house, which is fine, and they didn't want to come out and talk to us. The officers were able to convince that person to turn over the rope that they had already fashioned to aid in their desire to commit suicide. And they were able to discuss with this person a plan moving forward to get them through the evening, to identify somebody that could help them. And they felt comfortable with that plan moving forward. They, as we always do, talked with Dane County Mental Health during that call, informed them what we had, and let them know what our assessment was. I can tell you that Dane County Mental Health actually wanted us to force entry into that home and deal with this situation in a different manner, which was a little bit surprising to us because the person was in their home alone. And a home is a person's sanctuary, if you will, and there are many constitutional protections resulting from entry into a home. We flat out declined to enter that home at mental health's request. And again, we utilized our de-escalation and our communication skills to identify a much better outcome than storming into a house. So the whole model, quite honestly, may need some evaluation and re-implementation. I do think that perhaps a county-wide model may be the best. Clearly, it's going to be a potentially costly venture. I don't know where police, fire, EMS or first aid providers could potentially fit into that. I see Madison is exploring a mental health ambulance model. So I think you're going to find a lot of support from police departments and police leaders in finding additional ways to better manage the first line response to mental health crises, but that does not diminish also the need for ongoing care and treatment to hopefully reduce the number of first line mental health responses. I'm sorry for the long-winded way to get there.
Where is?
Any other question? Joe, do you have another one?
I'll let Gabriella go before I go.
Gabriela.
Thank you so much, Chad. I really appreciated your thoroughness. Looking forward to reading a lot of those reports that you have put together. And also, I'm going to share this with my constituents, and I'm sure that they're going to be very interested to have this really thorough overview. So thank you for taking the time to do this. One of my questions, I was pleased to hear about the hiring process and the changes you've made with Sarah, the HR director, over the last year or so. I'm interested about the community member part of the panel. And I'm curious if you could let us know how that person is chosen and what that looks like.
Yeah, it's a great question. And typically, what we've done is we usually identify community members either through their role in the community, maybe they're a member of a community organization or stakeholder organization, or they're a member of a neighborhood association or other situation. Examples of who we have used in the past include Dr. G, sat on our most recent command staff promotional panel, as did a member from our business community and a community member as well. So we had all cross sections of our community represented in that very important command promotional process. We had a female, we had a male business owner, and we had a community organization leader, and Dr. G represented as well. So we typically look to identify persons from communities of color or women, our ideal candidates to offer different perspectives than having all police members who tend to, generally speaking, be male on these panels.
Great.
And I will add that all of our efforts on hiring and recruitment, there's no benchmark there. The benchmark is obviously we're trying to hire the best and the brightest who reflect our community and its diversity, and to retain the best and the brightest. So it's always going to be an ongoing process of evaluation and improvement to see how we're doing and where we can get better.
Great. Julio, I do have a couple more questions, but I don't want to. I can give someone else a chance to jump in.
Okay, thank you. Randy has a question.
Again, thank you. Thank you for that detailed presentation. It was very interesting. One simple question on the body camera. I was surprised at, well, not surprised, but surprised in a good way as far as the use of the body camera. But do the officers have the ability to turn that body camera on and off at their discretion? I'm particularly concerned with as far as an incident. If there's an incident, can they simply just turn that off and it's not recorded? I'm just curious as to the use.
Yes, so our policy is out on our website, Older Udell, and there are very, very limited circumstances in which an officer can turn off that body camera. If they are involved in a police call for service and they are interacting with members of the public, they are required to have it on. There could be limited situations where they can turn it off. Examples include if they go into a hospital emergency room, for instance. They may be turning it off in order to prevent in order to protect patient privacy. We would suggest that they obviously turn that camera back on once they get into a confined area where they're not potentially exposing anyone else that may have been in view. There could be situations in our schools where they would turn them off in order to not have kids on video camera. In certain situations, if we're in a person's home and they want it turned off, we may turn that off as well. If they're on a traffic assignment on a crash and they're going to be doing traffic control for 2 or 3 hours, they have the ability to turn it off so that we're not unnecessarily taking up storage space with files that are showing zero interaction with the public. The officers actually also have discretion to turn that camera if they're in I'll back up one other area where they turn the camera off, and that's when they do what's referred to as deliberative process. That's where they will talk with the other officers if they're on, say, a domestic abuse investigation, and they need to capture all of that information to ultimately determine an outcome in a case. They will typically mute the camera. They don't turn it off, but they typically mute that camera as they collect all of that information and determine a course of action. So, but our policy does require an officer, even if they are in a private location, such as someone's home, if they're going to be arresting someone or if they're going to be searching, they have to have the camera on, even if the homeowner does not want that camera on. And we also allow our officers that even in situations where they may not need to have that camera on, they have full discretion to turn that camera on if based on their training and experience, they feel like that camera is going to be, and what it records is going to be important.
Very good. Thank you.
Next, Gabriela. Okay, Joe, he has another one too.
More of a comment than a question. Well, actually, I have a real probably simple question, and then I have a comment. So the simple question is, what percentage of your officers live in the city of Fitchburg? And then the comment, I would say, like one thing I noticed from the data is that there's a pretty high number of property crimes and larceny numbers. And I just wanted to sort of point out, and this isn't something particular to the department, but it's sort of a root cause issue, is that, you know, oftentimes property crimes happen because of, you know, poverty. And they, you know, there are root causes that are attached to the reasons why people steal things, break in houses, steal cars. And I just want to, you know, say, as we're talking about budgets and also as we're talking about, you know, why we have to call police in the first place, it's often tied to sort of more root cause systemic issues that, you know, really deserve more of our investment than we're currently giving. Not just here in Fitchburg, but also throughout our entire community. So I just wanted to put that out there, and then I'll, you know, I ask for the response for the question.
To answer your question on officers that live in the community, I don't have that percentage readily available, unfortunately. I will talk about the property crime, and clearly you are right that there are some causal factors that drive property crime without a doubt. However, I also believe that in light of those causal factors, there are clear public safety issues being created by that property crime. And a recent example that I can use is there was a vehicle stolen in our neighborhood off of Seminole Highway the weekend before last. In fact, 2 vehicles stolen from the same garage. One of those vehicles was used in a drive-by shooting in the city of Madison within hours of it being stolen. So while yes, some property crime is committed based upon need, theft from or shoplifting is a very good example of a crime that can be committed based upon person's ability to pay or lack thereof and basic needs. But going to someone's house into an open garage door or through an open garage door into their house, stealing both cars, using one of them in a drive-by shooting is another level. And that's where we can't have, in my opinion, an either-or situation. We need solutions to address root causes without a doubt, but we also have critical public safety needs in our communities. And you can see all of the violence that's been happening of late, particularly related to gun violence, and the amount of time that is taking police resources to investigate and respond to and try to prevent. And I can tell you that our department has been trying to prevent violent crime in a particular area of our city based upon the activity that's been happening in Madison, and it's tied to Fitchburg. A considerable amount of time and resources has been spent trying to prevent that crime from happening further. And that's why, you know, we need faceted approaches to this entire process.
Alder President, do you mind if I clarify? I just want to make sure that I'm not.
Okay.
I don't want to misrepresent what I was saying.
Okay.
So, you know, I know you and I sort of talked at length one-on-one and in meetings about sort of some of the activity that's happened, for instance, in my neighborhood that borders Madison, and you know, the thankfully the shooting that has not occurred in injury or death. However, you know, I just want to clarify that as an alder, as a citizen, as a person, I know that there needs to be a clear commitment and investment in making sure that people are safe. However, and I'm not making it either or, but I do want to just clarify that, you know, the reasons why somebody may steal a car, for instance, the reasons why somebody may act in a violent manner, the reasons why somebody may actually pick up a firearm and choose to harm another human being is often really deeply rooted in so many factors that, you know, I think as a society, we don't invest enough in, particularly in the Allied neighborhood where, you know, there are a lot of people that are really, really hurting. And, you know, unfortunately, oftentimes it ends up, you know, with some people and a small portion of the population, but some people in actual violence occurring. And that, you know, it's really on us as a community to ensure that we're finding multifaceted solutions. And oftentimes I think as a society, we sort of knee-jerk to rely on you all and the work you do and ask of you, I believe, more than we should. So I just wanted to clarify that point.
Sounds good. I appreciate the clarification. And by all means, as you mentioned, we've had a number of conversations recently, and I'm more than happy to continue conversation on this topic and any other.
Gabriela, you have another question?
Yes. So I was going back to the early slides about the budget allocation. 86% is personnel, and you said that includes overtime. And you might not know this off the top of your head, but like, is overtime a significant part of that personnel budget? I'd be interested to see a little bit more detail on that, and maybe that's something we can talk about later, but I just wanted to bring it up right now.
Yeah, there will, obviously is a forthcoming budget process where we'll be having deep conversations, but out of that money that's set aside for personnel, approximately $225,000 is for police overtime.
Okay. And then if I can just do another quick question. So I've definitely heard a lot of interest, and I mean, obviously there's a lot of interest in policing practices right now in particular. And I've heard from several people that they're interested in getting answers about their questions. And certainly you've provided a lot of answers, which I really appreciate. And I've been trying to get that out to people that have questions. But I'm curious if at some point in the next 6 months, you know, maybe after the use of force policy is updated, would you be interested in doing a listening session or a town hall? Obviously, we'd probably have to facilitate that being on you know, over the internet, but would that be something of interest, and can we explore that?
We absolutely can explore that. As you saw in the presentation, we have a history, and I have a history of community engagement and listening. So, you know, as things hopefully settle in the coming months, we can certainly entertain that option.
Great. Great, thank you. And I do have one more question, but I want to let someone else hop in, Leah.
Shannon has a question.
Yeah, so the number of car thefts, is it still like teenage kids that are kind of sweeping the neighborhood that's been happening kind of throughout all of our communities, kind of in Dane County, where kids are coming in and just kind of taking the car for a joyride and then dumping them somewhere if they're not involved in a car accident or things like that?
Yes, for the last several years, the typical mode of operation is that 2, 3, 4, 5 juvenile, typically males, somewhere between the ages of probably as young as 13 or 14 to as old as maybe 19 or 20, although that's typically not the case. We'll use 1 or 2 stolen vehicles, and they will drive around neighborhoods throughout Dane County. And you will see them checking car doors to see if vehicles are unlocked. If the doors are unlocked, they are entering those vehicles, and if there are keys involved in them, they are taking those vehicles. If the garage doors are open, they will enter the garage to see if there are keys or enter the vehicles. And if they have access to the keys, they're going to take the car. And as I mentioned earlier, we're now seeing where they're entering the house on more and more occasions. I think weekend before last, at least within the last probably 2 weeks, I think we've had 4 or 5 confirmed entries into homes through open garage doors into homes. So that is extremely concerning to me, and it's extremely concerning to our department, and it's extremely concerning to our community members when people are entering your home at 1, 2, 3, 4 in the morning.
Well, eventually I think somebody's going to get really hurt because they're not going to be met. You know, I think things are going to escalate fairly quickly, hopefully, if we can't get this under control. You know, and I know we've been urging a lot of our constituents for probably over a year now to really lock your doors, lock your car doors. Don't leave your firearms in your car when it's unlocked. Basic things like that. So I know we just got to keep reiterating things, and hopefully, you know, things don't escalate anymore, but it sounds like it already is. So that's all I had to say. Thank you for answering my question.
Okay, I have a question. In the last 5 years, talking about your budget, how has been the increase in average of your budget from 1 year to another one, and what was the cost principally? Was personnel cost increasing?
So obviously, again, we'll have a much more lengthy conversation dealing about budget here in the coming months. But if my recollection serves me correctly, our budget has probably increased from right around $7 million 5 years ago to $8 million, or just over $8 million this budget year. And as you saw, 86% of my budget is personnel. And in the last 5 years, I've added 3 department members with community and council support. 2 of those 3 department members are grant funded based upon our UCR data through the state, are partially grant funded. So the full financial cost of those 2 officers is not even being fully bore by the city of Fitchburg at this point in time. And that grant for those 2 officers was set to run through 2021 at this point. So the bulk of my increases are always going to be related to personnel. And I'm looking at, obviously, for my 2021 budget and getting ready to submit that next week. We're talking about the dollar amount that I have any ability to influence is minutia. We run a razor thin operation here on our budget, and there is not a lot to play with. And I'm not speaking about just the police department, but City Hall in general. The city of Fitchburg has historically, for the 20 plus years I've been here, run a very lean operation. I'm not the only department head that says they've got staffing needs. I can point to the engineering department, the building inspection department, the clerk's office, the finance department. It doesn't matter which department you look at, there's staffing needs there. And as I think Misty pointed out in her presentation, the bulk of our job is service related. And how do you provide service? With people.
I have another question for you. Regarding the police officers that they have the grant, and you said you have the grant until 2021. What happened after the grant? We don't get the money from the grant. Or this renew every year?
It's a 3-year grant that's running for 2019, 2020, and 2021. And it'll be up to the city council to determine what, if any, is done with those 2 positions if and when the grant expires and we're not awarded another grant to partially fund those officers.
Okay. Any other question?
Yeah, I have one more.
Okay.
Chad, so at the very beginning, I appreciated the mission, vision, and values, and that you just redid that. And I love to hear that it was an internal effort with a group of officers to do that. I'm a big believer in mission, vision, and values. I think that that's a really important part of driving people's actions. So I'm curious what the rollout looks like for the officers and what you have envisioned in terms of reinforcing those values throughout your trainings and throughout your work. What does that look like for you?
Well, we'll begin to obviously roll that out department-wide. Most of our members, if not all of them, have already seen them already. So this was obviously an opportunity for us to publicly unveil them. We'll take some efforts to get them, take down our old mission, vision, and values, which is currently on the city's website, and add our new statements to them. But what we'll be searching or looking to do is obviously prominently display them so that people see them on a regular basis within the walls of the police department. We do that with our current mission, vision, and value statements. But the fact of the matter is, as I've alluded to, is those statements are so long and so lengthy that you'd spend 10 minutes looking to read them in their entirety. And that was something that we wanted to improve with this particular update. So now when you see the statements, you're gonna be able to actually walk around and say, well, what's the mission of the police department? It's to serve and respect. It's simple. That's what I should focus my efforts on, serve and respect. So as we continue to evaluate our actions, our words, our efforts, it'll be evaluated through the lens of the mission, vision, and values to determine, are we meeting what we are intending to meet through our actions, words, and others? And it will obviously be utilized further through training and to deepen its involvement in our philosophical responses to calls and those sorts of things. So it will eventually become embedded into our agency. And the ultimate goal is that I could ask any department member to tell me what's our mission statement. That should be pretty easy. Our values, our vision statement is about 2 sentences. Ultimately, I would hope that we could all memorize that. And our values are service, teamwork, accountability, and respect. I mean, it's basic human tenets.
Thank you.
Any other question? I have a final question. What is the type of support that your police officers do they have when they come from a very traumatic situation?
It's a great question, and we've taken a number of steps to improve how we respond and provide services to our officers when they've been involved in a traumatic situation, or we recognize that the cumulative stress of the job is beginning to add up to where perhaps their performance is declining. But for the purposes of the question, I'll use the critical incident situation. The peer support team members that have been trained not only by the police department, but jointly with the fire and EMS, we do an initial check-in with officers by members of this team who have had some specialized training in conducting those check-ins. Basically, if I was involved in a critical incident, a member of that team would check in with me before I go home for the day or the night at the conclusion of my shift. ask me how I'm doing, if there's anything that the department or the peer support team member could do for me immediately. What sorts of supports do I have available for me at home? Is there family at home? Do I have kids? What are those sorts of things? And provide me with information and or resources that I could use in the short term. We will also then work with either our EAP or other contracted mental health services provider to set up a formal debriefing that will typically occur, usually I think it's between 24 and 72 hours after the incident, where they will come in and facilitate a debriefing with all of the involved personnel. We also include our dispatch personnel or any other non-sworn personnel that may have had some sort of role in it. If it was a particularly tragic incident and say a 911 call was placed, we would also extend an invitation to the Dane County Communication Center dispatcher that handled the 911 call to participate in that debriefing, again, to allow officers the ability to talk about the situation, and it allows our folks to hopefully begin a healing process. We regularly check in with folks who have had more significant critical incidents, where they may potentially have a scheduled visit with a mental health professional on a monthly or quarterly basis for a 1 or 2 year period based upon the circumstances of the incident they were involved in order to ensure that they have ongoing mental health resources provided to them, again, with the goal of ensuring that we have well police officers who are more likely to provide better police service to our community.
Okay. Thank you very much. So any other question? No? Okay, so thank you very much, Chad, for your presentation. It was very complete. And then next item in our agenda is announcement. So our next committee of the whole will be August 26th. So in that meeting, we are going to have a presentation from the Healthy Neighborhood Initiative, and we are going to discuss some of the topics that the Housing Committee described in the memo that is sent to council. So please, if you don't have the memo, we can send it back to you. But we are going to be discussing some of those issues in the memo. So let me know if you have any question or if you need to read some article about that. I can send you some articles. Yes. Misty.
Yep. Something I forgot to mention in my presentation a while back ago now, hate to flip gears on you. So I did send out the presentation to all of you. On Friday morning, I'm taping a segment with Fact TV just about that, how you calculate a tax bill segment. The thoughts being then that you could send that out to your constituents as just a video link if you think that would be helpful. Between now and Friday, if there was any piece that you felt like wasn't clear or you wish I went into a little bit more, if you could just email me that feedback and I'll try to incorporate it before I do that segment on Friday.
Okay, thank you. So I need a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor of adjourning the meeting, say aye.
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 The motion nays, the motion carries. So we are adjourning at 10.